Just our being together here is such grace, so much blessing for one birth. Just as last evening, Hari described how as Larry, with a sore leg from a fall during a morning ritual under LSD, and despite the subway ride, and despite the fact that nobody would join him to go, he still found himself going to hear Swami Satchidananda in New York City, and he said he was already working on me, that he could overcome my tamasic nature to get me to go through all that, to get to him. You certainly cannot believe any less of this moment, that forces are afoot in every one of our lives that brings us here. It is not by chance that we happen to meet. And it's interesting to examine that chance occurrence, because it's certainly easy at the moment when it's all beautiful to say, what grace, what a blessing. Certainly the Guru is smiling upon me to have allowed me to have satsang again. The reason it's worth examining is to see if the concept of some overriding plan can become such a dominant theme in our consciousness that when the drama changes, when the melodrama gets heavy, when you've just fallen from the tree, you can equally say, what grace. Oh, thank you. Swami Ramdas is reported to have said, when he had been thrown out of a temple one night and had to sleep by the riverbank where the mosquitoes were particularly fierce, and thus he couldn't sleep at all, he kept saying, oh, thank you, Ram, for coming in the form of mosquitoes to keep me awake so I could remember you. In the Ramayana, there are two places in the Tulsidas version where Ram makes it very clear that unless one honors Shiva, one cannot come to Ram. Now, Ram is an incarnation of Vishnu, generally connected with the preserving and maintaining and very loving and supportive forces in the world. Shiva, on the other hand, is often connected, associated with the chaotic or destructive or unpredictable or what are often called the malevolent forces in the world. And Ram says, unless you honor Shiva, you cannot come to me. There's a temple right at the very tip of India called Rameshwaram. Rameshwaram. It's where Ram did puja to Shiva before going across to Ceylon, to Sri Lanka, to rescue Sita, his wife. It's interesting to reflect on what does it mean to honor Shiva. It's so easy when you get high in a situation, whether it's satsang or whatever, meditation, and you say, oh, I feel the presence. I'm being given grace. But what about when you're despairing and you don't feel the presence? You think that's any less grace? Last night, Hari said one thing which I guess I disagree with the sort of attitude that he reflected. He said he was doing karma yoga a lot because he guessed he was just too gross to do any other form of yoga. Now, I must say that I shared that opinion about karma yoga. When I went to India last time in 1970, I went in order to meditate, in order to get holy. I had been lecturing and teaching in America and doing whatever my hypocritical poor light would allow. And my own hypocrisy overwhelmed me, and it drove me back to the feet of my guru. I was just drunk for satsang. I was hooked. I needed to get back to my connection. And my plan was to check in with him, get his blessing, and then go to a cave, which he would bless me to do. This was my mind, okay? And there I would sit with his blessing, and I would meet Babaji, and I would meet Buddha, and I would meet Christ, and I would hang out with the astral team, and they would give me all the secrets. And maybe I'd go north to the edge of Tibet, and I would get some deep teachings from the Tibetans, and I would take deep meditation practices on various visualization exercises. I might even be walled into a building for 3 years, 3 months, 3 days, 3 hours, 3 minutes, and 3 seconds. And I thought, when I come back to America next time, boy, it's going to be different. I'm not going to be just a phony yogi. I'll be really the real thing. And I went to, with the group that was together at that time, I went to Bodh Gaya, where Buddha got enlightened. Seemed like a good place to start, because I couldn't find my guru, because he was, as he is wont to do, so we all enrolled in these courses, these 10-day courses, and we took a series of them. And it was very intense and very austere. And we learned how to cheat and cut corners, but it still was pretty fierce. And there was no doubt that some headway was made in that meditation. But after about 4 of the courses, I could see that the slippage was increasing considerably. And that the thing that was missing was that my heart was very dry in that situation. I couldn't open my heart. And just at that time, I had been invited to Shivaratri with Swami Muktananda in Delhi, and I thought, wow, a good Shiva festival, that'll really get me moving again. But I didn't really want to just walk out on the meditation because I felt that's kind of a cop-out. I mean, here I came to meditate and I'm walking out, to go dance and sing, like any sloppy bhakti would do. So I entered into an arrangement with the most essence meditation teacher that during the monsoon, I found out where he would be up in the mountains, and we made a survey. We went up there in advance, and we found another house that would hold 3 people, and we rented and had to fix up the house, put a new roof on, new water system, got the house all ready. And I arranged that when he went off for the summer, for the summer monsoon, 3 of us would go and we would be with him, 4 of us, 3 or 4 of us. And we would just get all this intense training in meditation. And I thought, well, as long as I've organized it and prepared for it, now I can go dance and sing because I can do my sort of sloppy stuff because I'm really going to do the work later. Well, on the way to Shivratri, it turned out that we met Maharaji, my guru. And in my puffed up pride, I said to him, like a good little boy reporting his work, I said, I've arranged for this teacher and this house, and I'm going to meditate. And I told him this whole story with a question mark at the end, like, aren't I good? Or isn't that wonderful? Or isn't this just what you want? And his answer was, if you desire it. Well, that left me hanging. Because what he was saying is, you want an ego trip? Go ego trip. Okay? Now, I couldn't understand that. What self-respecting guru would say that meditation was ego tripping? I mean, that seemed like the height of profanity, yogic profanity. So I thought, well, he's just a silly old man, and he doesn't really understand. And maybe he's saying something much more profound that I'll only understand later after I've meditated. So I'm going to do it anyway. I said, humbly. So when the time arrived, I went up there, and I was so happy to get to this place because up until then, everywhere I'd gone, there were always Westerners. And it turned out I was always hanging around Westerners and after all, you don't go to India to hang out with Western consciousness. And I was always hanging around Westerners who were looking to me for something or other, which seemed absurd. I mean, they come to the well to drink, and then they're looking to polluted water they brought from the city. I mean, it's so bizarre. But there's a certain culture shock in India, and it's nice to have something to cling to, and I was sort of it. So I went to the mountains, and I was so happy I was finally away from all of them. Right? And that draggy having to be with them and answer and deal with the stuff all day. And I put away all the musical instruments and all the bhakti schmaltz, and I was going to settle down for serious business that was going to bring me to God. You got the set of the mind? Well, when I arrived there, within about 2 or 3 days, Westerners, other than the 3 people that had been invited, started to trickle in. First 3, then 5, then 8, then 11, till there were about 20 others. And they all said, I said, what are you doing here? Because I thought we were hiding out and we'd kept it really secret. And they all said, well, Maharaji sent us. he said, go be with Ram Dass. So we took over a hotel in the town. But I stayed up in the house with a group up there, and I wouldn't have anything to do with the people down there. I said, look, if you're in the town, that's up to you, but I'll come down and visit every week, but that's all. I don't want anything to do with any of you. I'm here for serious business. Well, then, another week went by, and the teacher didn't show up. And a letter comes from him saying, unfortunately, due to circumstances beyond my control, I will not be able to come this summer. And now I could see whose big hand was behind that. And there wasn't any doubt about that. So we arranged to take over the Gandhi ashram in the town. We all moved into the ashram, and we ended up having an ashram for the summer. We all disciplined ourselves. We read the Ramayana and fasted and meditated and lived in silence. We had a very profound, good summer together. Very beautiful, holy place. Okay, now the next component in that training program that is an answer to Hari's point last night was when I got to India this last time, when I was with my guru, he said, who do you want to see when you're in India? And I said, well, I'd like to see Anandamayi Ma, because to see the mother, to have the darshan of the mother, wow. He says, Acha, that's good. Who else? I said, I don't want to see anybody else, just you. So he said to me, see Lama Govinda. I said, Lama Govinda? I said, I've already seen Lama Govinda. I said, he's a very nice man. He's a good German scholar. He's a wonderful Lama, and that's lovely, and he's written some incredibly good books. But, you know, and he says, see Lama Govinda. So that was that. So I kept stalling. And then I heard that he was going to be leaving for Dallas. So Krishna Das, who's going to be playing the drums with me this afternoon, and Annapurna and I went over to visit Lama Govinda. Just to put a little flesh on the bones, just to give you a little feeling for the little divine play in the whole dance. Let me tell you the story in the rich way, rather than the bare bones part. Because the means and the ends are one, by the way, so there's no conclusion in anything I say. It's just like hamburger, it just keeps coming out. We had included a picture of my guru and Lama Govinda in the Be Here Now production. And in the picture was also Lee Gautami, Lama Govinda's Shakti, his wife. And she had taken the picture on an automatic camera, and we had cut her off in the one we had used in the book. And since we were not acknowledging anybody's contributions, we didn't acknowledge that she had taken the picture. And since all her pictures had stamped on the back of them, taken by Lee Gautami, we knew she might have a slight investment in this matter, and I expected to get a little flack from her about this when I should see her. Now, there was a little additional matter that Lama Govinda had written a letter to an editor of Newsweek in Chicago who had photostated it and sent it on to me, in which he said, these Westerners go to India and they take the first guru that comes along. They're so hot to get a guru. Take Dick Alpert. he went and he got hooked up with his second-rate mind reader. Right? Okay. So now I knew that, see. So I figured if Ligatami gives me any trouble about the picture, I will discuss second-rate mind readers, but otherwise I won't do it, see. I mean, I'm not going to just start out with, I just have a little thing in restore in case. Yogic love, it's just the social dance. So the time came for taking pictures, which it does at most of Lama Govinda's scenes, and I said, well, I'll stay inside. We'll stay inside. You go ahead. And Ligatami says, no, you've got to be in the picture too. I'm going to get back at you for... Uh-oh, she just did it. So as we were standing posing for the picture, Lama Govinda and I, with some other people, I turned to him and I said, do you really think he's a second-rate mind reader? That's all. I just looked right at him. Well, he went through just long enough to go through the chain to realize that he had just been had. And he lit up, and we looked at each other with total love. We had just broken through all the formalities, And from then on, our relationship was totally joyful. So that evening, the five of us sat together after the other guests had left, and his mind was beautiful. It was like an exquisite crystal, like a beautiful jewel, very clear mind. Now, he represented to me the kind of meditative jnana yoga, the intellect and meditation aspects of yoga, which to me have always been the manly, tough forms of yoga, see, as opposed to the bhakti and karma things, which are what you do if you can't do anything else, see, if your mind's too gross to do anything else. So I said to him, Lama Govinda, what is it you want me to do? Do you want me to go and to study, do visualizations? What is it you'd like now? What kind of... Maharaji sent me to you. He must have sent me to you for teaching. I now take you as my teacher. Tell me what to do next. I said, I can go on with my Southern Buddhist meditation or go into Northern Buddhism. I've been interested in the Nyingmapa, and I can go on with my Padmasambhava mantra, or what do you suggest? I sat as a seeker. And he said, no, you don't understand at all. He said, I've looked at your book and all that. He said, your path is the path of the heart. And he said, your heart is opening. It's all happening to you. You don't have to do anything. Now, he said that, and I wouldn't hear it, see. I said, oh, I know all that. But tell me, what should I do, see? Because you certainly couldn't assume you don't do anything. And he says, no, you don't understand. He said, you're doing your path already. So, now, coming from him... See, I mean, it's one thing if a bhakti says to you, go be bhakti. You say, sure, he's protecting his own investment. But when Lama Govinda, he's got to go against everything he ever talks about, roughly, to tell me to do that when I've asked him for teaching. So in a way, it was incredible that Maharaji would send me to Lama Govinda to get him to tell me that my yoga, see, was bhakti. That was part of it, bhakti yoga. So I began to reassess, bhakti yoga. It took on a new dimension for me now. I mean, it was going to be respectable. I wanted to call it that. So later, when I was sitting with Maharaji, I would say to him things like, Maharaji, how do you awaken Kundalini? I mean, just a question in the passing of the day, passing. And he'd say, feed everybody. Feed everybody. I mean, I'm ready for pranayam and bastrika, alam balom. Feed everybody. Maharaji, how do I get finished? Love everyone. And all he kept instructing me was, and all of us, was love, serve, remember. Love, serve, remember. Now, I couldn't help but break up over the cosmic joke that I should go to India, to the deep, dark, mysterious East, to learn the secrets that will bring man to final realization, to bring them back home to the primitive tribes in the outer lands, right? And I come back bearing the gift of 3 words, love, serve, and remember, which have already been hanging around here for years, as I seem to recall Christ reminding us. And in the 2 years I was in India, I think in total, there were 14 days when I was not surrounded with Westerners, doing exactly the same thing I do in the United States. So what I was forced to recognize was, I was forced to do what's called a figure ground reversal. Because what I saw hanging out and talking about God with people was what you do until you do the real thing. Okay? And now I had to flip it over and see that maybe that was the real thing, and all the other things were support systems. Now, faced with the possibility that the rest of this incarnation, or at least at this time, my Dharma was to do karma yoga and bhakti yoga, I started to examine the nature of these yogas a little more carefully, since I was stuck with them, apparently. And I must say, I shared that little tone of that quality in the way Hari put that, although I'm not attributing to him that he shares that opinion, but the tone that I got from the way he said it. That you're so gross, you just do karma yoga and bhakti yoga. It's sort of, we used to think of there are gentle paths, like going to church on Sunday is a very gentle path. Then there are steep paths like Zen Buddhism, where you just sit and think of nothing. And most people can't stand that because that's too steep. They need a support system like a god or something or a church or a ritual to cling to. And there are these different steepnesses of path. And karma yoga has always been connected with doing good, gray ladies serving in hospitals, and, sort of a nice, gentle way to come to God over the next 10,000 incarnations. So a deeper study of the Bhagavad Gita, which of course is the text for karma yoga, among other yoga. And I entered full steam into karma yoga. Figured, well, if it's my yoga, then I'll do it. Now, when I came back to America in '72, I was living not in time. I was going to live like my guru lives. He's just somewhere until he isn't there anymore, and then he goes somewhere else. And you never know when he'll be there or when he won't. I figured I'll live outside of time, because time was really scaring me about the West. Schedules, and you're going to lecture, like you're going to lecture Thursday night at 8, like Saturday morning at 9 o'clock. And many hundreds of people are going to be expecting your consciousness to get them off at 9 o'clock on Saturday. So everything you did Friday night, everything you did Thursday, Friday, if you had a lustful thought on Wednesday, that was going to affect Saturday morning. So you had to watch it, and you had to get so programmed. And if you had 2 a week, you know, it wiped out the whole week. You had to just sort of sit in like in a straitjacket to just stay together enough. And I was like, time was my enemy. I was always like afraid to let go. So I thought, look, I'm not going to live in time. I'm just going to live. I'll just be where I am. And people would call me from New York to New Hampshire, and they'd say, will you be there tomorrow afternoon? I want to come see you. Meaning, will you be holy tomorrow afternoon at 2? I'd say, I don't know. They'd say, well, what do you mean you don't know? I'd say, well, I don't know where I'll be tomorrow afternoon at 2. Meaning, not only I don't know where I'll be geographically, but I don't know where I'll be in terms of my consciousness, because my consciousness, unlike Swamiji's consciousness, is not nice and even and smooth and together. I'll tell you, I'm not going to be the only one to do karma yoga this morning. I'll tell you that right now. My mind is a little bit like a roller coaster, and it's not any roller coaster that you ride the same route each time. Each time it's a different route, so you can't tell if you felt you get really it's all pouring through you, and everybody looks at you and they see the highest light, and you say, oh boy, all I got to do is keep cool, and this is the way it's going to be, you know, and I can just be the transmitter. And so you make a plan for tomorrow at 3. Tomorrow at 3 comes, and somebody drives up the driveway, and you think, oh God, do I have to see them? Oh God. You know, I want to see Perry Mason on television. I've got to see these people. Now, I don't want to see Perry Mason, but I do want to see Perry Mason, see? Because I want to see Perry Mason, I hate these people driving up the driveway. And I don't want to hate them because I'm a holy man. I want to love them, but I hate them. Okay? So I thought, okay, I'm going to change all that. I'm only going to be holy when I feel holy, right? People come and I don't feel like seeing them, I'll say, go away. Or I'll just disappear. Or whatever. You know, I just won't be holy unless I feel like being holy. And when I'm holy, I'll be really holy. Because I was tired of being a phony holy man. Because if they've driven from Ohio, see, and they come to see Ram Dass, and they walk in, and you wait the last minute, turn off the television set, and you rush up, and you light an incense and candle, and you sit down, and they come in and you say, welcome. You know, well, that kind of hypocrisy, you can only live with yourself so long. I mean, it's just too heavy. It's just too ugly. You know, it's just too horrible. So, and my guru had kept saying to me, tell the truth. Tell the truth, Ram Dass. He kept catching me not telling the truth. That was the problem. I mean, really little things, you know. I'll just give you a little quick example. I've mentioned this in lectures in the past. But once I won't tell the whole story, just a little part of it. A judge, a high Supreme Court official from Uttar Pradesh came to have Maharaji's darshan. And we were sitting on the outer rim, the Westerners, and the Indians were in close, and which alternated from day to day. And Maharaji gave this high court official a tremendous buildup about what an important man I was in America, which he had never done, and I never even thought that it was remotely relevant to anything he and I did together. He said, ex-professor, big university, you know, and he just full of lies, oh, incredible stuff. And he snowed the official, you know. Finally, the official, with great awe, really, because turned around and he said, well, I'm honored to meet you. See? And I said, well, how do you do? He says, perhaps you'd like to visit the High Court. Now, in truth, I had no desire whatsoever to visit the High Court. I come from a family of lawyers. I've been in courts, and I didn't go to India for that particular trip. So I said to him, well, that would be very nice. So he said, well, tomorrow at 10? So I thought, uh-oh. So I said, well, you'll have to ask my guru, figuring he'll get me off the hook. So he says, Maharaji, can Ramdas visit the High Court tomorrow at 10? And Maharaji says, if he says it'll be very nice, it'll be very nice. He'll come. It's always pointing like this, like, watch it, baby. I tell the truth. Just little ones, little social, those little white ones, those don't hurt anybody, There was a woman with him one day, and he came up and he said, do you remember her? And I said, oh, yes, and I didn't. And he said, yes, she's Dada's sister-in-law, and Dada's from Allahabad. So I said, oh, yes, we met in Allahabad. She says, no, we met right here. I said, oh. Maharaji went like that. It's just these little ones he was always getting me at. It's like, tell the truth, babe. Come on, tell the truth. Truth gets you high. Tell the truth. So I thought when I came back to America, I'll just be straight. If I'm not feeling high, I won't make believe, I was trying to get very, very straight, okay? So it came, I sort of floated around the country just being wherever I was, and when I felt really together and like it was clear and I was calm and centered and loving and had something to offer, I was with people and it was beautiful, and I could feel Guru's grace coming through on people, and then when I wasn't, I just went off and, read and studied. Then I decided, I had just done 4 or 5 lectures with Allen Ginsberg as benefits for Trungpa Rinpoche, and I decided those were in time. Those were the first things I had done in time. And then I thought I'd go into a retreat for a month. So I rented a cabin in Tucson, Arizona, in the mountains south of it, which had a kitchen, refrigerator, stove, beds. It was a bird estuary, so there were lots of bird lovers. Those were the only people there. Me and bird lovers, so I was not relevant in their universe. So it was a certain kind of privacy, even though there were other cabins. And I walked into this place and found, to my dismay, that the one other thing that the cabin had was a television set. Now, I had gone in to do a prayer. I was going to do a prayer for 30 days. Which was the Sutra of the Third Chinese Patriarch of Zen, which is just a little tiny booklet, and I was just going to work with that for 30 days. But I spent the first 8 days, roughly 12 hours a day, looking at television. Now, after I looked at television for the first day, I was so horrified that I might spend the next 29 doing it, that I took a screwdriver out of my car and I unwired the television set. And I put it in the closet. And I put a blanket over it. And I put it way behind my bag and everything. And I closed the door and I sat down. And around 5:30 I thought, well, I could just look at the news. So I took the television set out, wired it up again, looked at the news, and suddenly it was 1 a.m, right? Three or 4 cans of beer later. Now, it's very hard to think of that as sadhana. However, in that cabin, besides the television set, and all the food that I had filled the refrigerator with, and the bed and the bathtub that I could take frequent baths in, and all the different ways I could play in my sensual delights, there was also my consciousness sitting in that cabin saying, far out. Imagine that, you know. You going to tell anybody about this one? I mean, sitting me with that guy that said, gee, I think if I take the broccoli and put some of that spaghetti sauce over it, and bake it, it'll be just like a pizza, and oh boy, and if I do that, you know, and then I can get that done quick so I can watch Kung Fu and, you know. That guy was doing his thing, and this other voice was saying, far out. Or Maharaji was saying, teek, teek, it's the way it is. Okay, right. Okay. There was the voice in me that was sitting watching all this, just noticing it, witnessing it, watching with, at first, horror. See? Because when you meet Shiva in yourself, you are horrified. When you meet him anywhere, he's really scary. In the Shiva Stotram, it says, when Shiva dances, the beings in all three worlds tremble. In all three worlds tremble, because his dance is so violent. And when I'm sitting in there with the television set, you know, I get in this funny predicament. I get the food ready just as the program began. This particularly happened to me not long ago when the Watergate hearings started. See, Watergate, even more than my orality, is watching Watergate, okay? And I was sitting with the Watergate hearings just began, and I had the food, but I couldn't eat the food till I consecrated it. But I couldn't stop watching Watergate long enough to consecrate it. And if I didn't consecrate it quick, the food would get cold, okay? I mean, you can't look at television and go, Brahmavanam, Brahmavanam, Brahmavanam. I mean, it's, you know, it's just too shoddy, you know? Okay. I mean, you're faced with these real dilemmas, right, in doing sadhana. And I think you should recognize that this is where it really hurts, you know. This is where we live most of the time, you know, unfortunately. Well, then the next week I managed to, I would just unplug the set and put a cloth over it. I wouldn't put it in the closet. And I found I was getting a little bored, so I was only looking at television 3 or 4 hours a day. And then I got into feeding birds and studying bird names and things like that. By the third week, I was sitting a little quieter and deepening a little bit, and I could sit by the river for a few hours, and I was starting to eat more simpler food, and I was losing interest in television. And by the fourth week, I was really in pretty calm, centered space, and I was starting to feel that energy again. I was getting that place that you get when you've been here for 9 days. That connectedness, that, yeah, right, that's what it's about. Whew. Wow, whew. Boy, this is the real, yeah. You all know, I'm sure. Well, while I was in there, I looked at the whole scene and I thought, you know, really, if I'm going to do karma yoga, I really should just go into it, really just go into it. And I had a big folder of places that had invited me to speak. And I just kept them in a folder and wrote back saying, I don't do that kind of thing, but if I ever do, I'll let you know. Benefits and lectures and all kinds of stuff. So I said, okay. I got the inner message, because I live totally intuitively now. Because what we in the West call intuition, I would call the voice that's guiding me from within. And sometimes my intuition is a reflection of certain of my desires, and sometimes it's a reflection of a deeper voice. And I never know which one it is. And sometimes it tells me to do something, and I start to do it, and then it turns out it was just another ego trip, and it falls away. I see its impurity. And sometimes I start to do it, and it feels right on. Go, 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 and I just stay right in this space as I'm doing it. Then I know, right, that's right on. It's all a hunt and peck process of learning to hear that inner voice, because you can't hang on the coattails of the guru every minute saying, Swamiji, what do I do now? Should I sharpen this pencil now? Should I sit? What shall I do now? You know. When I was coming to America, I said to Dada, Maharaji's devotee, I said, Dada, you're lucky. You hang around Maharaji. If you do something wrong, he's always telling him, do this, do that. He said, look at me. I'm, thousands of miles away. I can really go off the deep end, and I don't mind doing myself in karmically, but I don't really like doing other people in. That's a heavy, And I can do that because I have a lot of lust left and stuff, and I may manipulate the whole game just to make it with somebody. I don't trust me at all. See? And he went to Maharaji, and he told Maharaji this, and Maharaji sent back the message, Ramdas shouldn't worry. I wouldn't let him do anything wrong. Okay. Now, how does he not let you do anything wrong? Do you think suddenly a little angel comes fluttering in and says, stop, like in fairy tales? Or no, it's the guy sitting in that cabin in Tucson saying, more kung fu, okay. More beer, more baths, more, wow, yeah, right. It's that place in me that knows, and it's just letting me do what I need to do as I'm getting closer there, and it never lets me out of its sight. Okay. To let you in on the secret of the game from where I'm sitting perceptually, the universe that I live in has only two beings left in it. There is who I still think I am, who I think I am. Okay, that's the illusion. And there's, Sam. You can call Sam God, or you can call Sam Guru, or you can call Sam whatever you'd like. I call it Guru. And as far as I can understand it, my universe, the universe of the illusion of who I think I am, exists solely for the purpose of bringing me to it, to the Guru. That is, that everything that is happening to me, that has happened to me, or that could happen to me, is a teaching being given to me as grace to bring me to the Guru. Not just sitting in satsang, but tripping on the rock as you walk down the path. It's all of it, the teaching, if you can flip around and see it that way. Now, under those conditions, karma yoga takes on quite a different aspect. As I'll point out in the brief time that's left to me by my inner clock, so deciding to do this tour, I decided, all right, I'm really going to do it to myself. I mean, if you're going to do karma yoga, really do it. Don't just screw around, do it. So I took a big map and I laid out all these lecture dates in terms of schedule and geography, and I got to the point where I had scheduled myself to lecture in a different city every night for 2 months, and then in the third month I started to loosen up a little bit. So I was only doing, say, one every 3 nights. So I started, and I went up the coast of California and Washington, Seattle, and Portland, Olympia, Seattle. Everywhere I went, either Swamiji had just been or was about to be, it turned out. I'd get to a place and they'd say, you know who slept in this bed last night? But the difference between us is he doesn't do it as karma yoga, he's just doing it. Because he is it. He is the statement of the yoga. And I understood that's what karma yoga is about. Not to say I am serving, but to become the service. You become here's what happens. See, I started out, and every night, here's the routine. Every day, you get up, have your morning beverage, as it was said last night, which for me is coffee. Sometimes a bagel. Okay, then you go to the airport. You go through security, open your bags. You go and you get on an airplane and you sit in the airplane for so many hours. The plane lands, you get off the plane, you walk down the runway, gangplank, and you walk, whatever it is, and you walk into the hall, and there are these beings saying, "Oh, Ramdas, Ramdas," and you say, "How do you do?" And they take you, you pick up your bag, they take you to where you're staying. You either do some press conferences or radio stuff or meet a group, and then at 3 o'clock I take a nap because I say to everybody I had hepatitis and I have to protect my liver, and I go to nap for a few hours, then I get finished. Then there is dinner, which is usually some kind of a satsang gathering, a very beautiful potluck thing somewhere, and we all get together. It's very lovely. Around 7:30, move to the lecture hall. I sit down, tune up the tambura or get the shruti box ready, whatever it is. Work with the musicians that have gathered to help me out. 8 o'clock I start. At 11 or 12 I stop. I am delivered back to the hotel or motel or room. I take my peanut butter and crackers and my milk, drink that, look at the late news, go to bed, get up the next morning, meditate for a few minutes, have my coffee, go to the airport, go through security, get on the plane, get off the plane, pick up my bag, say hello, namaste. Have you got the microphone? I prefer a mini boom because I have a beard, and when the lavalier is there, you can't hear through the beard. Oh, yes, I understand. I need a cushion because yes, of course. Take the rest, go have supper, go to the lecture. Next morning, get up, have your coffee, go to the airport, go through security. It's no different than working at a lathe, see? You know, every day you get up and you lecture. Now, what happens is, I saw that the only way to survive, I started to get sicker and sicker and sicker, first of all, because the schedule was grueling. And by the time I got to Vancouver, I didn't have any voice, which was funny. I mean, I was about to head for Anchorage, Alaska, and I didn't have any voice left to speak. And I was sitting over a hot vaporizer and, doing the whole thing, mantra and everything. Saying to Maharaji, "What do you have in mind now? I mean, it's pretty far out. How am I going to speak without a voice?" And he had said to me in India, he says, "There's going to come a time when you're not going to want to lecture anymore." See? And I kept repeating that to myself, and I kept saying, this must be the time, but I still wanted to do it. Because quite honestly, what I'm working with is power and fame and all these worldly things that are connected with exactly when Swamiji said, "Who doesn't know Ramdas?" Of course, everybody applauds. And what am I supposed to go through then? Like it's... Like if 40 people come to see me at a day in the farm in New Hampshire, I get stoned out of my head from the satsang, and I walk in and my father says to me, "Had a pretty good crowd today." See? Like he's counting cars, see? I mean, that's a cultural background that I come out of, And I've got to work with that all the time. That's my work. You got to understand what karma yoga really is. It's working with your desires right in the middle of the fire, right in the field. It's dying into the thing. It's dying into the service. So that I realized that the only reason I was getting fatigued and wiped out and physically run down was because I still wanted something. Like after a beautiful satsang, I'd be just hardly in my body. I'd just be sort of floating around, and we'd all be staying. Nobody wanted to go home, that place where nobody wants to leave. Somebody would come up and say, "I have a beautiful place just a few miles out of town, and there'll be about 10 of us, and we'll cook a beautiful thing. Why don't you come on back now? It's around 12 o'clock at night. Now, I know if I go back, that's at least till 4 in the morning. Next morning, there's the airplane, the security, the coffee. That's not going to change, see? So I realized that as long as I desired to go, and I'd say to them, oh, I wish I could go, but I can't. And I remembered, oh, that's what I hated about time. Time kept making me turn off life. And then I thought, no, time is merely making me turn off my desires. All I have to do is just desire to become the pure instrument of service, that's all. I'm going to become like one of those 747 planes. Not like the pilot, but like the plane. Somebody gets in the plane and moves it from here to here. It doesn't say, oh boy, I'm flying to New York. Or I bet I'll be big in Denver. You know? It's just an airplane. You move it from here to there and it does its thing. It goes, and it just flies. Okay? And I recognized that for me to understand the exquisiteness of karma yoga was going to mean that I could do this every single day until there was nobody doing it at all. It was just being done every day. Till every day there was just the moving, the flying, and it was all sadhana. There wasn't one tiny bit of it. You come up to the security guard and the guard sees you as a potential bomber, you know? That's Maharaji, that's my guru, who's just taken through central casting, gone to the costume department, and he's come out as the guard, and he's saying to you, well, see if you can see through me this time. See? Do you know I'm God in here, or do you think I'm a security guard? Are you so paranoid that you're busy reacting, saying, I'm not the bomber, I'm not the bomber? I'm a nice guy. And everybody I meet every day is the guru in drag, as far as I'm concerned. See? And the sickness and the fatigue and all of it is the grace. It's all the grace. It's all the grace. It's all the grace. There is nothing left in my life other than teachings that are going to bring me to God. It's the only game in town. Nothing else has any meaning. What else am I going to make meaningful? Just as I make it meaningful, like I'm busy watching the Watergate. I can't wait for Dean to get on the stand, you know. And at the same moment, I'm sitting inside saying, you can't wait for Dean to get on the stand. Because let me tell you that once that thing has happened enough to bring you into this room, as far as I'm concerned, it's all over. Now it's the mopping up operation, which may take many lifetimes. It's all purification from here on out. It's just cleaning up. It's getting your body together, getting your heart open, getting your mind calmed down. And understanding that a conscious being recognizes that she or he has taken birth, and the function of an incarnation is to end suffering. And that means wherever it exists, on any plane it exists at. And you recognize that the optimum thing you to do to end suffering is to work on yourself, and how you work on yourself depends on your dharma. What is your route through? And for me, my work on myself is through doing what I'm doing this minute. If I think I'm doing this, I've still got a way to go. Until this is just being done, and I'm just as much part of the audience as you are. Am I attached to being the speaker? Am I looking for the rush of your appreciation? Now, the honoring of Shiva, it's now 5 minutes past. I will allow us 5 more minutes. The honoring of Shiva, it's easy when you talk about Shiva, you know, over there in India, with his ashes and his, you know, all his buddies he hangs out with that are so scary, you know. And his wife, oh my God, Kali, wow, wow, jeez, far out. That's easy. Okay. Then you can bring it over here and you say, well, I look at pollution and look at lying and stealing in government. And look at murder and paranoia and rape and, oh, boy, that's Shiva. But get a little closer still when you're ready. Okay. And realize that in you are all those forces as well. The Bhagavad Gita is talking about an inner battle. An inner battle. The battle between that voice that says kung fu and broccoli with some sauce on it. And the guy that says, I want to watch kung fu and I want to have the broccoli. That's the battle, those two guys. And that goes on and on and on and on. And everything you do, you know, when people come to me and they say, should I do this or do that? And I know that as a good yogi, I'm supposed to say good yogic things like, do this or stand on your head or something like that. But I must honestly admit, what I mainly say to people, it doesn't matter. Because whatever you do, you'll do as consciously or as unconsciously as you are. Do it all to bring yourself to God. Don't get caught in the form you're going to do it in. Just do it. And as you come closer to God, you find out, in fact, there are only certain things you can do, because you can't do things which increase illusion. You can't do things which increase suffering. You just can't do them because they're just too absurd. It's like taking needles and sticking them in your hands. Why are you going to do them? If I screw you, I'm just screwing myself. Who am I hurting? It's only us. That's where I'm sitting. I've got this little economic story that's fun. It's just a little fun image to play with. I've talked about before, my father heard that we were putting out some records very cheaply, and we were trying to lower prices of things and doing everything very economically, and that I was not trying to collect or amass money. And he says, what's the matter? Are you against capitalism? This is the ex-president of a railroad, right? So I said, no, Dad, I'm not against capitalism. For you, I think it's great. It's just not my style. He says, I don't understand you. I said, well, that I understand. It's interesting. We love each other incredibly, even though we're on different trips, because compassion doesn't mean you lay your trip on anybody else. It means you become it so perfectly that you become the light that draws. You don't go out and say, come on, Dad, wake up. See? But I said, I'll try to share with you, since you don't understand, I'll try to explain. I said, didn't you just try a case for Uncle Henry? He's a lawyer. He says, yeah. I said, you win it? He says, damn right I didn't. It was a tough case. I said, boy, you worked a lot on it. He says, I sure did. I said, I bet you charged him a big fee. He says, of course not. It's my brother-in-law. I said, well, that's my predicament. See? Everybody's my brother-in-law. Like, who am I going to rip off? Okay? And he could hear that. See, he could hear that out of a Jewish middle-class background. He could hear family you do one thing with, and them you do something else with, see? Okay? And if he's mashugana enough so the whole thing is his family, that's, you know, he's a good kid anyway, you know. So. In conclusion, when you leave this place and this blessing, this mitzvah, when you leave this, I can assure you that you will come down. And I can further tell you, although you may forget it, that that is as much of the teaching as this is. And the down and up is all part of the dance. And the game is not to get high, but the game is to be. And be includes highs and lows until you're no more attached to your high than you are to your low. There's bliss, there's depression. Right? There it all is. There's the whole panorama of Maya. All the positive states and negative states. It's all more stuff. Divine stuff, the Leela. And in it all, here we are. Here we are. And the meaning of honoring Shiva is to give space to all these forces, to recognize them, to allow their being, to not try to shove them under the rug. There is a terrible habit we have of getting holy too fast. Intellectually, we know where holy is, and we figure out, well, I want to be like Swamiji, so I'll put on those clothes and I'll act like that. And you do it from outside in. You can't do this game from outside in. You can play at it, but you're going to keep, that inner voice is going to keep being horrified by your hypocrisy. And then you say, well, I'm really nowhere. And the statement, I'm really nowhere, is the recognition of being somewhere. That is it. See, people come to me and say, I'm no good, I'm depressed, or I hate everybody. And I said to them, well, if you hated everybody, you wouldn't tell me you hate everybody. You know? It's that story I've told about. I am now 2 minutes over because I have lack of self-control. It's nearly over. It's okay. I've nearly run out. Some years back at Millbrook, a girl called in the middle of the night, and she had taken some mysterious chemical and in Los Angeles, and she was freaked. And she called up, and she got me in the line. She said, I've gone crazy, and I'm going to kill myself, and I'm insane. And she laughed hysterically, and she did it. She showed me she was insane. And I said to her, well, who dialed the phone? You know, the 4 digits and the 3 digits and the 3 digits and the 1 digit and gave the number and the whole thing. She said, I did. I said, well, would you put her on the phone because you're crazy? So let me say that once you have tasted, once you've touched, once the connection's been made, once we have acknowledged each other's existence, once we know we're here, you can't get away. You can't get away. You may go under really deep and feel, I've lost it. And then you'll see yourself standing there, I've lost it. And you'll break up. Oh, have I lost it? Oh, am I depressed? You know. You get bored. Oh, I'm bored. Oh, I'm so bored. Oh, I'm bored. See, and then you let yourself be bored. Oh, I'm still bored. Still bored. I'll try to meditate. Now I'm bored with that. You know, I'm bored. I'm bored. Oh, I'm so bored. Oh, and everything's boring. Nothing's, yuck. See? And then you become totally bored, and if you become bored, then it's done. Right? See, the game is, if you're so afraid of all the Shiva forces, you keep pushing them away, they keep clinging. It's very interesting to use the golden chain to pull yourself out of the mud, what's called the Satwig chain, of being good and pure and doing good and pure things. It's good to help you get out of a lot of other stuff. But remember, you're holding on to a chain, and that chain can bind too. And to get caught in good and evil, while you're using good and evil as a method, just remember that behind good and evil we are. Behind good and evil we are. Shiva and Ram are two more faces of that which is indescribable and unknowable and unseeable, but only beable. It's really very, very good to be with all of us. And I guess this afternoon, after a few more rounds of the drama, we will sing together. Namaste. Well, this is the second of the Seasons of Our Lives conferences that I've attended. And I'm again impressed with Bill's courage in bringing together such a potpourri of presenters. While my vehicle is words, I don't really believe anything I say, because the nature of my work concerns the spaces between the words rather than the words themselves. For I'm dealing with an area, a realm of human existence that is basically not conceptual. And I'm faced with the predicament of trying to convey a non-conceptual realm through concept. So I must ask you at the outset to take my words with a grain of salt. If you don't like them, don't worry about them. They will pass quickly. In order to understand the stages of life and ultimately the process of dying, one has to have a context in which to understand these things. And the context usually is defined as what is the meaning of it? What am I doing here on earth? Because having an understanding of one's function or purpose makes one understand whether some process that's going on in transformation is functional or dysfunctional, whether or not it's useful or not. I mean, I think none of us are so naive at this point, certainly not in this gathering of professionals and people related in related fields. None of us are so naive as to think that only that which gives pleasure is useful. I think most of you now have found through your own experiences that there is incredible growth through suffering. That doesn't mean that we would go around programming suffering into people's lives. We don't give suffering 101, which is electrodes under. And yet, when we look back at our own lives, we see that some of the most profound changes occurred at the times of the most intense suffering. And the nature of the suffering is that we are confronting a situation which is dissonant or disparate from the model we have of how reality ought to be. And that's really what the cause of suffering is. The cause of suffering is this place in your mind that's defining how you think it ought to be. So if you think things should be a certain way and they're not, then there's a discomfort and you suffer. And a lot of what our suffering has been is not due to the actual characteristics of the situation, but to the way in which we perceive the situation. And that perception is based on our contextual understanding of who we are and what we're doing here. So that I must delve a little bit more into the philosophical underpinnings of your and my existence for us to have an appreciation of what the seasons of our lives, particular reference to dying, how to perceive them, how to understand them in a useful way. I'll paint a scenario that just give you a little example of what I went through in some of my processing. I'm in Benares, the city of dying in India. In the Hindu religion, the highest way in which you can die is to die in Benares.
And when you die in Benares, your body gets burned at the burning ghat, and the bones and ashes get thrown into the Ganges River. And through that simple act, you are spiritually freed. And we'll talk a minute about what that might be about. The result of that belief system is that Benares is full of people dying. And most of these people have no money whatsoever. They are beggars at the most extreme states of survival. Many of them are lepers. They have a loincloth, man or woman, just a loincloth, and maybe a begging bowl. Many of them have advanced states of cancer. Many of them are just skin and bones. They are dragging themselves through the streets. And often on their loincloth, there is a little sack which contains the money necessary for the wood for their funeral pyre. Now, if you think of yourself as a human being and think of them as a human being and empathize for a moment with their predicament, here we are in Orange County having just had a nice lunch and being in comfortable, soft chairs, it's hard to imagine even identifying and realizing these are fellow human beings. But they are. They're just like us. They're just got a different place in their minds, and they're in a different life moment. When I first came to Benares, when I went out in the streets, I was in a very open space. And when I looked at these people, I experienced such horror. I couldn't really handle it at all. And I went back to my hotel room, and I am somewhat embarrassed to admit, I literally climbed under the bed. I hid under the bed, just in horror of the situation. Because I walked through the streets with my American Express traveler's checks in my pocket, with my security, with my ticket back to affluent America, and I was facing these other human beings in the extreme state of need and poverty. And my pity was more than I could handle. Subsequent to that, I met my spiritual teacher, and my whole life took a different turn, and I ended up living in a temple, studying Hindu philosophy, doing deep meditation, hatha yoga, so on. And I began to understand a different context about what life and death was about. And now, about 8 months, 6 or 8 months later, I found myself in Benares again. And I walked through the streets, and this time, it was an entirely different experience for me. For when I looked into the eyes of these people, I saw in them not what I expected to see in the past, not self-pity, not frustration, not humiliation, not anger, not pleading. They had a look in their eyes of fulfillment. And then I noticed something else in their eyes that I could hardly believe. They were looking at me with pity. They were pitying me. Healthy, fat, solid American me. These people in the last stages of life were pitying me. And I understood that from their belief system, they were pitying me because I was merely this wanderer wandering through life, not knowing where I was going or where I was coming from. They knew their place. They were secure in their place. They were fulfilled in what they were about to do. And they knew that I was wandering in despair and I would never find. Probably not find. And they just felt sorry that I was so lost. And I had trained enough so that I could see it from their point of view, and I ended up feeling self-pity. Now, to me, that's an example of how a belief system can be so strong that it can take what could be called a sad tune and make it into a happy tune. It can change the entire meaning of a situation. In the villages in India where I live quite a bit of the time, there are many beings who make 2, 3, 4 rupees a day. That's 40, 60 cents a day. And they have one meal a day, and they live maybe under a railroad bridge, crowded together. Not optimum living conditions. But sometimes when I look at their faces, I experience a being, a quality of their being that seems more in tune or in harmony with the universe than I find in the face of somebody who is affluent, successful, everything in the West. And I understand once I get over my arrogance of super race arrogance, that we have a great deal to learn about the dignity of the processes of life and death, and the way of understanding them in a way to release us rather than to torment us. I have to digress briefly to just share with you my own sequence of perceptual shift a little bit so that you can appreciate the kinds of things I want to talk to you about. For I was trained as a social scientist. I was a professor. I was actually part of a junta at Harvard to protest against the soft and mushy conditions of the clinical social psychology department, social relations department. I was one of those guys in favor of harder statistics, the kind of guys you love, right? I just felt that anybody that didn't know how to do a factor analysis and a chi-square just hadn't yet awakened. And though I played that game as hard as I knew how, for all the points I knew how to collect, there was in me, despite my psychoanalysis, there was a very gnawing uneasiness that I was missing something, a malaise. And when we experience a malaise in our culture, we tend to treat that malaise as if it is our fault. We treat it as if it's our neurosis, and it's our lack of adaptability to the existing culture, which must be right because there's so many of them. And I kept trying, like fitting a square peg into a round hole, I kept trying to readapt my being to fit into the gratification patterns that the culture was offering me. And it just wasn't working. And I started to drink more, and I started to get more extreme in my ways of seeking pleasure in order to gain the kind of fulfillment to give me a feeling of well-being. Well, then I got for some years into experimentation with psychotropic chemicals, chemicals that alter consciousness, and that changed my head around a great deal. I saw through those experiments that perhaps my malaise, my discomfort, was not just my pathology, but it was a deeper something in me attempting to awaken. And that maybe instead of treating it as some sickness that ought to be treated as a problem, I should see it as something graceful, to be honored. And maybe it would be useful to allow my life to adapt, to tune to those feelings of wrongness or rightness within myself. And I did that, and I just let my life go in the course it would naturally take, responding to an inner intuitive sense of, right, okay, that's all right. And it took me through, away from academia, it took me through psychedelic chemicals, it took me to India, it took me into yoga, and it brought me back to America, and it took me into a different kind of a perceptual view of the universe. And I found, much to my surprise, that through whatever had happened to me, had very profoundly, in the real sense of alteration, had profoundly altered my feelings about death, and as a result, my feelings about life. It had very profoundly altered the definition of who I think I am. Now, I could try to very gently take you into the space translating, but instead of doing that, I'm going to do a much more shock treatment process. I'm just going to tell you how I see the world. And many of you will say that is absolute rot. And that's perfectly okay. It's okay in advance. You have total license to reject it. But anything less than that would be dishonest on my part. So I'm going to go for broke. We'll let the chips fall where they will. Okay. I mean, I've convinced you I'm a nice person. I speak softly. I seem friendly. So now maybe we're ready as the blow falls. You knew I couldn't sit cross-legged up here and not. And I'll even be more outrageous by telling you that what I'm presenting to you is not a belief system. It's the way things are. See, already your shackles are up. But what can I do? Anything less would be dishonest. I just got to play. You've got to know people like me exist. To the extent that I am anything at all, and that we can open for question in a little while, seriously, we could consider me as a separate entity, a set of predisposing characteristics. You could call it, it would be like a DNA code, except we'll make it psychic instead of physical. I am a set of characteristics, a program that is manifesting by taking a human birth at this time. I have taken a birth into a body, and that body has with it a personality. I've taken a birth into a personality, and that personality is in a body. And I am going through a set of experiences, which is called living life. And these experiences have a certain function. These experiences, if used consciously and intentionally by me, are vehicles through which I can awaken to who I am in truth. Let me take you through an example I often use, just another little metaphorical image, an analogy. Imagine, for example, that you have next to your eyes a little control switch, and you look at another human being on channel 1. And what you see when you look at the other human being is a physical body. Man, woman, old, young, fat, thin, pretty, handsome, ugly, interesting. If you're a scientist, you might call them mesomorphs, ectomorphs, and endomorphs. Okay? It's a matrix of individual differences on physical plane. It's the plane of standing on the corner watching all the girls go by. It's that reality. Now let's just say you're looking at another person and you flick your television receiver one channel. Now you look at another person and what you see is their psychology. Oh, you're a manic depressive. Oh, you're a happy person. I wish I was happy like you. People in psychotherapy live on this channel usually. They see everybody in terms of personalities that just happen to be traveling in bodies. Okay? They're totally preoccupied with their own depressions, elations, fears, anxieties, loneliness, hopes, etc. And that's reality. That's the real you. And the physical body is merely the carrier of that. Well, let's flip it again. Flip it again and you look at another person, and if you are so trained to be able to see on this channel, you would say, oh, I know who you are. You're a Libra. I can tell because of the... You're a Sagittarius. On this channel, on channel 3, there's only 12 beings in the universe and various permutations of them. Okay? You are now seeing what could be known as the astral identity of an individual. You're seeing another plane of reality. You're seeing another way of looking at individual differences. These are 3 ways of looking at individual differences, 3 matrices, if you will. But now you flip the dial once more. It starts to get interesting. Now if you flip the dial and look into another person's eyes, you flip the dial inside your own being and look into another person's eyes, what you see is another being looking back at you. Inside an astral configuration, a personality, and a body. You in there? I'm in here. How did you get into that one? And you see what the Christians call soul. You see another soul. You see another being just like you, no different, just like you, just another being. And that you see that all the individual differences are all of the stuff in which this being is encased. Now, you could almost be comfortable with that one, but we unfortunately must flick the dial a few more times. I mean, I must take you the whole journey. You flick the next dial, and what you see when you look into someone else's eyes is you see yourself looking at yourself, looking at yourself. Because on that plane, there is only one of it. It is one awareness that is in a multiplicity of forms. And finally, if you allow me to flick the dial just once more, if you haven't given up completely yet, you flip the dial once more, and you disappear, and I disappear, and the dial disappears. And we're dealing with what the Buddhists call void, or in the New Testament, before the word. That is, before the vibratory uniqueness, or why God is not able to be spelled in the Hebrew religion. It's unspeakable, unknowable, unseeable, unconceivable, inconceivable. Okay, now, of all of these channels on the television set, who are you? Which one do you want to settle for? You want to be middle-aged? How about that one? I mean, I'm middle-aged. I guess I'm middle-aged. I have a 47-year-old body. It's like I have also a 1974 Dodge van. But you say to me, who are you? And I don't say I'm a Dodge van. Okay. Why do I choose to identify with this? Well, if I don't pick body, should I pick personality? I'm somebody on the path. That's a good one to be. I'm a curious person. I'm curious about the future. That's a good one. I'm a responsible person. Well, I'm kind of wild. I'm lazy. I'm working on myself. These are all different psychological takes of who one is. Each plane, each turn of the dial has a different statement of your identity, and each one is getting into a more and more profound place. Now when we come back to who am I, which channel are you talking about? If we start from the top and go on down into the grosser and grosser planes, I am the void who manifests as the one, who becomes the many, who has a unique set of factors to work out through a unique astral, psychological, and physical body. That's what I'm doing on Earth. I have taken a body to do certain work. And when I finish that work, I will drop that body. We are dealing here with the issues of karma and reincarnation. Now, in the West, after the councils of Trent, Constantinople, and Nicaea, anywhere from about 200 to 500 AD, these ideas were roughly thrown out of Christianity because they didn't make the church a workable situation. Because when you had reincarnation and karma, every human being became their own priest, because it was between you and God. And for the church to keep its own control, it needed to use and see its function as keeping people morally living properly. It had to get rid of those concepts. Have I taken birth before? I have no experiential knowledge of that. But from where I'm sitting, undoubtedly thousands and thousands and thousands of times. Will I take birth again? Undoubtedly thousands and thousands and thousands of times. I have to tax your brain with one more difficult concept. As long as we were dealing with your body, with your personality, with your astral identity, or with your soul, we were dealing in time. Time passes, things change. The minute we got up into the higher plane than that, in the one, there is no time anymore. Time is relative. Now we're dealing with the place where when you know yourself as that, you just are. You are going nowhere and you are coming from nowhere. The Zen master says your going and coming is nowhere but where you are. Now, if you can start to sense, I mean, you don't have to believe what I'm saying just because it's the way the universe looks to me. But if you could empathize just enough to appreciate how it would be to be looking at the world from this point of view, here's a story that will explain that. I'll give you an example of it. Chinese were coming into Tibet, and they were very harsh on the Tibetan monks, who they saw as part of the decadence of Tibet. And they were very cruel to the monks, and they were disemboweling them and shaming them and killing them. And one particularly vicious commander of the army came into a village, and he said, bring all the monks before me. And he said, they've all fled to the hills except one monk in one monastery. And the general was pleased that they'd all fled because he knew that then his power was known. And he couldn't understand why this one monk hadn't fled. And so he went to see the monk. And the monk was standing in the middle of the courtyard of the monastery. And the army commander walked up to him and he said, why didn't you flee? Don't you know who I am? I could take my sword and I could cut through you without blinking an eye. And the monk looked him in the eye and said, don't you know who I am? I am somebody who could be cut through by your sword without blinking an eye. And at that point, the commander bowed and left. Could you imagine what space that monk is in? Could you imagine what it's like to see your life as so functional to your awakening and your death equally so, that the whole business becomes merely a process of growth and awakening and opening and deepening and clearing and shifting channels. And there is no problem about transition. There's no holding on out of fear. It's just opening. Ramana Maharshi, the great Indian saint, was dying of cancer. And he had great miraculous powers. And his devotees said to him, Bhagwan, Ramana Maharshi, heal yourself. And he says, no, this body's used up. And they said, don't leave us, don't leave us. And they started to cry. And he said to them, don't be silly. Where could I go? That's like me saying, I'm selling my Dodge van, and you saying, don't leave, don't leave. I'm not leaving, I'm just selling my Dodge van. Could you imagine conceiving of death from that point of view? I have a project going, working with terminally ill people, and it's not... I take exception to Dr. Comfort's, some of his criticisms this morning of hospice and of Elizabeth Ross and so on. But it isn't their work. Their work, which I think is extremely admirable, which is an attempt to make dying more psychologically humane, to take it out of the clutches of the medical profession, which treats each death as a failure, and which puts you in a hospital which is a temple to life, in which the only way to deal with death is denial. And I've had to sit through many horrendous moments in hospitals, sitting with somebody who's dying, where the doctors come in with a cheerful, you're looking better, and then walk out in the corridor and say, won't live the night. And the person is surrounded by doctors, nurses, relatives, all of whom are so frightened of death. Ministers, rabbis, so frightened of death that there is a surrounding hysterical denial of the process, leaving the person at the moment when they need most to be able to share what's happening to them, a total void of that kind of compassion. And I'm sure most of you have seen those situations, and many of us have participated in, not knowing quite what else to do. And the hospice movement has done an incredible amount to change the image of dying. They are doing for dying what home deliveries and so on, and bringing the husbands into the hospital during the deliveries is doing for birth. It's bringing it out of the closet. Suddenly we're getting over our Victorian uptightness. It's now suddenly true that human beings do not only eat, but they go to the toilet. Bet you never knew that. And they are born and they die. In India, it's very far out because it's all right out front. When somebody dies, they wrap him in a sheet, and sometimes in a little village, they'll put him in a rickshaw to take him to the burning ghat. And there's a dead being sitting in a rickshaw on the way to the burning ghat. And everybody salutes as he goes by, or she goes by on the way to the burning ghat. And there's no, which we have, which is the minute the person dies, they disappear into the big void beyond. The sheet goes over, and the whole thing is covered, and denial starts immediately. So hospice is doing a great deal just by training people to be compassionate listeners and psychologically able to hang out with people who are dying without freaking. My own work is a little further out than that. My work is for people who say, I would like to use my death as a vehicle for awakening. I would actually like to use the process of dying as a vehicle for awakening, since I have an understanding of the kinds of things you've been talking about. Now, you've got to understand that that tradition of using death in that way is understood by more people in the world today than there are who don't understand that. I mean, we're talking about China, we're talking about India, we're talking about Japan, we're talking about all of the Eastern countries, which population are many. So for such a person, one sits down and one is first very straight. There's no hiding, there's no deception of anything. Your own fear, out in the open. We share it, very straight. But in addition, we are working on ourselves to create a space, an environment, in which a person can experience the deeper parts of their beings. And when they get to one level of it, where time isn't, then there's no more death. Sometimes I just go and I sit in a room with somebody that's dying, and I merely sit there quietly with them. And they run all of their fear through me. And what comes back is peace. Because I don't have any fear of death that I can touch at the moment. To me, death is a process of just leaving what you thought you were. Not what you are, but what you thought you were. They run their fear through, and what comes back is peace, and they release a little bit. And then they run more fear through, and they get back peace. And they run more fear through, and they get back peace, until you can just feel them. They're just like a flower, opening and extending and opening out, until again and again you're sitting with somebody who is in incredible pain and suffering, and you're saying, oh, it's so beautiful. I'm feeling such peace. And at the same moment, the ravages of cancer or extreme heart conditions or whatever, Hodgkin's disease. I was working with a boy who just died 2 weeks ago. And I would come in each time, and he would be agitated and irritated, and he had bed sores, and there was a lot of pain and suffering. And I'd wash him and help change him and just be with him. But at the same moment, I was just being quiet inside my own being. In other words, I wasn't coming on to him. I wasn't saying you ought to go deeper in yourself. I wasn't hustling him. I was merely working on myself in his presence. And the result of that was that very slowly he started to let go of identifying with the body, identifying with the pain, the psychological part, and started to experience just a spaciousness in which he could see death. Death comes, birth comes, life comes, growth comes. For you to be of any use to someone that is dying, for me to be of any use, there is one simple rule. You work on yourself. You don't work on the other person. We have a model that is so deeply ingrained in us often as professionals. You're healing someone else. You're doing for the old people. You're doing for the young people. You're doing for the dying people. I have a very simple rule in my life: work on myself. Because all I can offer to you or to a dying person or to a marital problem or to some child, I can only offer my being. And my being is the result of everything I've done in my life to get to where I am. That's all I have to offer. I have my love to offer. But if you can flip through those channels, that love is not conditional love. It's not based on individual differences. It's merely the love because you are seeing the divine plan made manifest again. Every moment of your life, once you understand the purpose of it, is your vehicle for awakening. This moment is your vehicle for awakening. If you're uncomfortable at this moment, okay, you're uncomfortable. Allow it. If you're fascinated, be fascinated. Allow it. Give it space. Give it space. Imagine a picture, and the picture is a picture of a cloud. And if the cloud fills the whole picture frame, all you see is the cloud, and you're totally immersed in the cloud. But allow a little teeny bit of blue sky around the edge of the cloud, and then imagine identifying with the blue sky instead of the cloud. From that point, you can say, cloud. The difference between I'm depressed or I'm depressed versus, wow, am I depressed? Or I'm depressed versus, look at that depression. Whew. Boy, I don't think I'll ever get through that one. Wow, that's a heavy one. Boy, that's the worst depression I've ever seen. I don't think people live through those kind. Now, the second kind I'm doing is showing the ability to keep a sense of humor in the middle of the depression. Well, if you've got a sense of humor, how depressed could you be? See? But that's the issue. It's the issue of the tiny bit of spaciousness that surrounds the identity with the happenings of life, the experiences of life. It is said in the spirit mystic literature, one to me is loss and gain. One to me is fame and shame. One to me is pleasure and pain. Meaning, there's fame. Hello, Ram Das. That's fame. Ram who? Das, did you say? Don Das, yes. Right. Oh, you're that horrible guy that was, that's shame. Oh, you just won the lottery? That's gain. Wallet just stolen? Loss. Oh. Pleasure. Oh, my darling, come here. Oh, my leg hurts. In each one, they take you completely, get lost in it. I'm somebody who has a hurt leg. Versus here I am, and there's a leg that hurts. The predicament is that most of us don't want this kind of consciousness because we don't want to lose the rushes or the trips of life. We don't want to forego the romanticism. We don't want to forego the rush that comes from identifying with our own melodrama. And that kind of equanimity, that kind of quietness, that kind of spaciousness, that kind of presence, that kind of compassion for oneself and for all things, because from a quiet, clear place, you see how it all is without pushing or pulling. For it is only the non-attached mind that can truly appreciate how it is. Otherwise, you're just seeing the projections of your own desires. If you're hungry and you get down the street, you will notice restaurants. If your car is making a strange knock, you will notice gas stations. If you are horny, you will notice makeable people. And that is what your universe is full of. Because you and I are living in entirely different universes, because each individual is living in a universe created of selecting from the possible infinity of things, those things which lock in with your own desire system. So if you identify with a desire, that will determine what you see in the world. When you get to the point that you can allow a desire system without identifying with it, sure, I have lust. Sure, I have greed. Sure, I have fear. Sure, I have depression. But here I am. I am. I am, and there's an aging body, and I am, and there's depression, and I am, and there's hope, and I am, and there's planning, and I am, and there's death. How different the space. That's because the television channels, you're living on more than one of them simultaneously. You're starting to live on all of them all at once. There are some very heavy processes that occur at the time of death. And the Tibetan Buddhists, for example, understood that the meaning of life was the preparation for death. You were preparing to stay conscious through these incredibly heavy processes that happen. Heavy process, example. A fellow called me the other day. His mother just died. He's a meditator. He's a Buddhist. Meditative person. He sat with her through the process. He said at first she protested, then she acquiesced. He said then it got to the point where she was too weak to eat, so I had to feed her. And he said that we made fun of that. We thought, well, I used to be the child, you used to feed me, now you're the child and I'm feeding you. And that was kind of fun and playful. Then it got to the point where she lost her sphincter control and her bowel control, and I found myself carrying her to the toilet with her feces dripping down my leg. And that was a hard one for us. And then it got to the point where all of her unconscious processes started to rise to the surface, and I found in the middle of the night sometimes she would be calling to me, and I'd go over and she'd start to make love to me. And all of the Oedipal stuff was coming up. And he said, and through it all, we still kept the thread. We still kept the thread of consciousness with one another. It's not the physical death that's so scary, it's the psychological death. It's the ceasing to be who you think you are. The thread was held. And I have been now with many people and just holding them as they die. And being right with them, looking in their eyes as the spirit just leaves, as they just leave. And the last breath occurs and the eyes glaze over and the being just leaves. And there's just a release, an opening. Because by the time they got to that moment, they were no longer clinging to that which dies. Don't be silly. Where could I go? There's no more clinging to that which died. For who we are was, is, and will be And these are just processes of transformation that we're going through. Just like it's very hard for a prepubescent to understand the time will come when his baseball cards aren't that relevant. So the time will come when even our mortal coil isn't that relevant. I gave a scenario at the last workshop, and I liked it because it's so explicit. It's a very heavy, far out one, but I'll give it to you anyway. If you will just imagine somebody who has died, okay, and they died in the Western, I'll give you two people. One has died in the Western metaphor, see, so they're busy not dying. Doctor, save me, transplant me, implant me, do whatever you do, but don't let me die. But you're dead, then you die. And a voice says to you, hello. And you say, well, if I can hear a voice saying hello, I guess I didn't die. The voice says, no, you died. You say, well, I can't have died. And that's confusion. It's called purgatory in Christianity. And you just sort of hang in that place, and then you get reprogrammed into the next round. But now, as you go through incarnation after incarnation, on and on and on and on, somewhere along in the sequence of these, you begin to awaken just a little bit. And you get to the point where you begin to hear what I'm talking about. You begin to see, wow, far out, that's all that happens when you die. So as you're dying this time, instead of, doctor, doctor, you say, wow, this is going to be great. Here we go. Ready? Put on your safety belt. Here I go. Ready or not? Oh, wow. Ooh. Now you're dead, see. Somebody says hello, and you say hi. Okay? Now you're in a new predicament. You're still somebody. You're not nobody yet. You haven't finished your rounds of birth and death. So you're going to take another incarnation because you've got more stuff to do. You've got to go through more experiences. So you have a list of things you've got to go through, see. You say, gee, if I did it right, I could clean up all of these in one birth. All right. Let's see. If I took birth as a child in the poorest tribe in Africa, that would be good, because I'd clean up that one. That was the one I got from being that king 50 births ago when I misused that. Then let's see, if I'll get raped when I'm 9. That'll be beautiful. That would take care of that one, see. And then, see, I'll get syphilis at 13. I could die at 17 and clean the whole thing up. Far out. Okay. So now you've got a problem. You're all ready to do this. You've got your plan, and you put a little sign on you saying, this is all just a scenario. This isn't reality. You put a sign on it, and the sign says, I am somebody who wants to take this birth looking for 2 other people who need me, karmically, like I need them, And the computers whir and all kinds of things happen, and within 1 million or 2 Earth years, something comes up. Doesn't matter, it's going on anyway. And these 2 people say, let's have a baby, or there's a moment of passion, and there you are. And as you're being born, you say to everybody, well, see you later. And you dive into Earth, and you go, wah, wah, and you're a baby. Veil over. You were a baby, that's all your reality is, a baby. 9 years old, you're raped. 13, syphilis. 17, you die. No, I don't want to die. You're dead. You come up and you say, everybody says, hi, back so soon. Right. Well, that cleaned up all those 5 now. Okay. Is that too gross for you? From where I'm sitting, I've got to up-level it just one bit by just saying to you that since the reality that lies behind all these relative realities, there is no time, all your reincarnations are happening simultaneously. I mean, that's a little heavy for you, but you got to understand that it's not like it's spread out like Bridie Murphy, like you were that 40 years ago. It's all here now, all your incarnations. So that when you get all done with the last one, you realize nothing happened anyway. I mean, I'm pushing your mind all over the place. If you could see the universe that way, what would be the difference in the meaning of death? Well, I'm finishing chapter 3. Now, I'm not saying that you should have a mind intellectual overlay that makes everything different that way, not a dishonest imposition of intellect. But for anybody that will subject themselves to simply sitting down quietly and learning how to quiet their mind by allowing the thoughts to come and go. Just as simple a thing as following your breath. Just take 2 minutes now. Bring your awareness to your breath. Just notice the breath. Either notice it going in and out of your nose, or notice it rising and falling in the middle of your abdomen. Pick one or the other and stay with it. Notice the breath going in. Notice the breath going out. And notice the little transition points between the in-breath and the out-breath, and the out-breath and the in-breath. Keep your awareness focused on your breath. Let the rest of the thoughts come and go, just like tiny little insects around a light. If you notice feelings in your body, notice them, and then let them go. If you are thinking about what this is all about, notice that thought, let it go. Come back to your breath. Breathing in, breathing out. The thought we are sitting in a school auditorium in Orange County at a conference, a set of thoughts. Notice them, let them go. Floating by like leaves on a stream. Thinking about the future, remembering the past. Thoughts coming, going. Bring your awareness back to your breath. Deeper, quieter. Follow the breath carefully. Follow the in-breath, the moment of turning, the out-breath, the moment of turning. The silence in the room, notice it, let it go. Come back to the breath. The breath is the focal point. It's the primary object. The rest of the universe comes and it goes. Problems come into mind. Notice them. Bring your awareness back to your breath. Staying right in this place now. Don't move yet. That is the first method that you use in order to begin to be aware of who you are. You can do it anywhere, anytime. You don't need beads, you don't need priests, you don't need ashrams, you just need your breath. Because while you are following your breath, which is the doorway between form and formless, because between the in-breath and the out-breath, and the out-breath and the in-breath, there is the space. Now let me give you one more exercise to find the whole other quality. Focus in the middle of your chest, just as if you had two nostrils, and breathe. Now, as if you were breathing in and out of the middle of your chest, let your nose or your mouth breathe in or out the oxygen. But imagine that your chest is simultaneously breathing in a very soft, very delicate mist. Breathe in, breathe out. When you breathe in, let that mist pour through your body. Let it pour up into your head, to your arms, to your torso, to your legs. And when you breathe out now, breathe out all of the heaviness, all of the tightness, all of the guardedness, all of the disappointment, all of the pain, the loneliness. And then once again, fill in the in-breath with this very, very soft mist. Let it wash through you just as if it were Drano, cleaning through all the tubes. When it dislodges something, a sadness, or a doubt, or a fear, just breathe it out. Breathe deeply. And then once you feel you have loosened as much of the stuff that holds you back from knowing who you are as you can at this moment, then become like a director of energy and take in this very fine mist, fill your being with it, and then breathe it out and send it towards those beings with your thoughts, send it towards those beings who suffer. Whether their suffering be physical, psychological, or spiritual. Just as if you were surrounding them with light. You were surrounding them with a loving space that said, do what you must do, but know that I am here with you. Use the power of your own thought and the openness of your heart to give life and love and space to all beings. And you can get so that every in-breath is a blessing you receive. Every out-breath is a blessing you transmit. With those two exercises, following your breath to quiet your mind, and breathing in and out of the heart to deepen your receiving of love and your compassion outward, you become an environment in which everybody you meet can grow. You become an environment of quietness, of non-judgment, of love, of presence. For you to share the higher channels of consciousness, you must know them in your own being, not with your intellect, but with your being. When Gandhi was on a train that was leaving the station, a reporter rushed up to him and said, "Mahatmaji, would you give me a message to take back to my people?" And Gandhi said, he scribbled on a piece of paper, "My life is my message." To die consciously, you must live consciously. To live consciously, you must have the courage to go inside yourself to find out who you really are. To understand that behind all of the masks of individual differences, you are a being of beauty, of love, of awareness. When Christ said the kingdom of heaven was within, he wasn't just putting you on. When Buddha said each person is the Buddha, he was saying the same thing. Until you can allow your own beauty, your own dignity, your own being, you cannot free another. So if I were giving people one instruction, I would say work on yourself. Have compassion for yourself. Allow yourself to be beautiful. And all the rest will follow. If there are any pressing questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Yes?
Is it only happening on planet Earth, or what do you have on
A question is asked about the existence of beings on other planets in our universe.
Well, I think that there are many planes of reality, and there are many beings that exist on planes other than the physical plane of reality. I think you're asking a question about the physical plane, about the physical universe, beings on other planets. I know nothing about any of that. I do know that there are beings living on other planes of consciousness and that this is merely another plane. So that you could look at planet Earth or the physical plane, not Earth, the physical plane, as a certain kind of training ground for people who have certain kinds of work to do. Buddha talked about them as being beings that had one of the 5 hindrances. That those were the people that took birth on the physical plane because they needed the kind of grossness of the sandpaper of the experiences of the physical plane to do the certain kind of purification. So, and he said that the 5 hindrances were lust and greed was one of them. That's just one. Hatred and ill will, agitation, sloth and torpor, which means inertia, and doubt. And that if you didn't have one of those 5, you didn't take birth on this plane, you took birth on another plane. So that's who we are to begin with, which makes us rather a colorful lot. And so in that sense, there is that this is the earth, and there are other planes that are what are called the heavenly planes. There are all these lokas or planes. In almost every tradition you find these things. And they are all equally as much the projections of desire systems, just subtler and subtler ones all the time. And so beings take birth here and then take birth on other planes. But in answer to your question, I think about the physical universe. I don't know. I don't know.
At this capacity to absorb the Eastern mystical experience and you not get extensive exposure to that.
The question was, would I have been open to the Eastern mystical tradition had I not had such extensive experience with psychedelic chemicals? The answer is that I probably would not have. However, somebody who is now young in this culture now would be able to. In other words, at that time I wouldn't have. Now I might. If I wasn't so encrusted and closed in by the time I'm 47 and have bought a model so tightly that I don't have any space, then I wouldn't be able to hear it now. But now the environment is supportive of hearing this message, while 15 years ago it was not. I think that the psychoanalysis was useful. I'm sure everything in my life has been useful. I mean, I look back on all my experiences now, ones that when I was in the middle of them, I thought, oh, nobody's been cursed like I've been cursed. And then I look back now and say, wow, so that's what that was about. Well, far out, look at what I learned from that. Isn't that interesting? Right? I tend to think of psychotherapy now as sort of like body and fender repair work. It isn't the essence of my being, but it's good to keep, you got to honor the whole organism and the personality and the body as well. My diets, all of that stuff is ways of honoring the container I'm in, if you will, which includes my personality. But what happens is that as you start to break the identification to the grosser planes and start to identify with higher and higher awareness in yourself, you find that the individual differences that before were a problem for you are no longer a problem. They are merely a definition of your uniqueness. So that I would say that my neuroses didn't go away. I've just made them my friends. Okay? They're just kind of irrelevant. They're irrelevant friends to have around. Okay? I'm just as neurotic as I ever was. Right? Yes?
This is a question about the relationship between creativity and mental health.
Well, I didn't hear Dr. May yesterday, but I do feel that the Western model of creativity is based on neurosis, and that there is a whole other way to understand creative act, which means, for example, Bach was amazingly non-neurotic, and he certainly was a prolifically creative being, and so have been many creative beings, with very little anxiety. And I understand creativity the way I understand it is, just as Einstein said, I did not arrive at my understanding of the basic laws of the universe through my rational mind. Rather, he went inward into a higher way of knowing, an intuitive space, another plane of consciousness in which the universe is. Outside of time, it just all is. And then as he comes back from that, what's called a mystical experience, he comes back in, and then his training as a physicist leads him to take that non-conceptual thing and conceive of it into physics. And so Bach goes into these spaces and comes back, and he hears the whole symphony. It's all there, just like that. And then he just comes back and writes it out. So that my feeling is much less that we are learning versus we are remembering. My feeling is much less that we create rather than we tune to. As far as I'm concerned, the entire universe is within us. We merely have to quiet down enough to hear who we are. And as you become more conscious and less mechanical in the sense of being identified with the things which are within law, like body and personality, which are within deterministic law, as you move into pure awareness, you are freer in that sense, and out of you, every act becomes a creative amalgam of all of the things in the universe. That's what Taoism is about. That's when you see a monk, you can see the way he walks is a creative act. The way he washes a dish is a creative act. His calligraphy is the creative act. You can see just in the form of the movement of the hand, the creative act. It isn't now I'll be creative. It's just a creative way of living. It's a way that's in flow with things around you. And that's what that breathing is about. It's about opening you up until you just become part of the force or the flow of the universe. And there's where creativity is from where I'm sitting.
Okay. This is a question about how chakras work.
The chakras, or psychic energy foci in the body, of which there are 7 in the body and there are some over the head, are a way of conceiving of the process of transformation of consciousness via the route of focusing on energy. Okay? Working with the kundalini or the shakti or the energy or the prana or whatever you want to call it. That's one route of doing it. Okay. Like if you're climbing a mountain, you could take the southern route or the northern route or the eastern route or the western route. One route will be meditation. You could just sit down and follow your breath. And in the course of that, all your chakras will open and all the energy will flow and it'll all happen. And all you did was follow your breath. Or you could do breathing exercises and bring the energy up your spine, the sushumna. Another method, the south route. Or you could do service. My route is service. Of love and service. I mean, my daily life is my vehicle of coming to God. You are my exercise on myself. That's my vehicle. And I am yours. So that's karma yoga, okay? So it's just another route through. And it is a way. It's a very beautiful way, but it's only another way. So, thank you.
Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Can you hear me back there? Can you hear me in the back? Okay. So we gather again and again to reassure ourselves about who we are and how it is. Perhaps who we aren't and how it is. Because we get so caught in thinking we're somebody doing something, going somewhere, or there's something to do. I don't think I'm going to be giving the beginner's lecture tonight. I think I'll just let go, because I just looked at you all as you came in, and you're me, and I'm just going to talk to myself. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, just listen with your heart. It's okay. The words are completely confusing. Just assume I'm totally insane. I guess we haven't evolved to the point where we really can spend a whole evening just being silent together as a lecture. It's interesting that in the silence is really the answer to the mystery. The words just keep your minds quiet, our minds quiet, so that our hearts can hear each other. Because we're really here to acknowledge and honor our hearts. Not necessarily our emotional, romantic heart, not necessarily our anatomical heart, but the sin, the heart mind.
You and I were so well trained, we were so well socialized to be somebody. Our parents told us who we were. Our schools told us who we were. The culture told us who we were. If you just ask the question, who am I? Every answer you give is really a lie. Because it's a concept. It's a limiting condition. It's a prison. I'm Richard. I'm a man. I'm 55 years old. I'm an Aries. I'm a seeker after truth. I'm a lusty, greedy, doubting, agitated person. I'm depressed. I'm happy. I'm overwhelmed by it all. I'm responsible. I'm laid back. I'm confused. I'm hurt. I'm suffering. I'm out for fun. I am the Spirit. I'm God. I am the One. I am. Every one of them is relatively real. It's sort of real. But it isn't all real. And who you are is at least all of those. Do you ever notice how many eyes there are each day for you? There's the eye that wakes up. There's the eye that needs to go to the bathroom. There's the hungry eye. There's all the different eyes you go through each day. Thousands and thousands of little images of yourself. And one hardly knows another. I can be walking down the street so holy, so connected to the Spirit, and I see somebody that arouses my prurient interest, it's called. And suddenly I am Mr. Horny. And my whole mind has dropped. And all my love of us has turned into object. And under those conditions, I'll use anything. Wouldn't you like to come up and see my holy pictures? I'm Ram Dass. Let me help you. And who I was a moment ago is horrified by this person. This person would screw that one at the wall to get what it wants. We are all thousands of these beings. And they're a loose confederation that we call our ego. And they all sort of are organized around a structure. You say, that's me. That's me in all my many facets. It's an inner joke. We learned all these self-images. They're concepts we have about ourselves. And they are so fascinating to us, and they are so efficient for getting us through the world, this plane, that we don't hear the whisper of the other parts of our being. They kind of get lost in the shuffle of efficiency, of keeping it together on this plane. And everybody gets really grounded. They all know their zip codes, they have a job, they get their act together, they get their laundry done, the oil changed, pay your taxes, you keep it together. But have you ever noticed that even when you're doing it extremely well, you feel a little trapped? You feel a little bit like you're being had by the universe. It's interesting, people work to realize the fantasies of the culture. If you get educated, get a degree, get a good job, have a family, get a home, get insurance, have a car that works, you get it all, you're going to be happy. But have you noticed how you get sucked into, this is great, but if only it's like this hot tub, there's a squeal in the sound system. This hot tub is magnificent, but wouldn't it be better with some perfume oil? Let's have some incense. Wine would be great in the tub. Music would add. And you just keep adding one thing after a partner. Now we're getting closer. And you have moments when you say, this is it, this is enough. I've got it. And then it goes through your hands like slish. And a moment later, well, what do we do now? So it's, let's go to dinner. Wow, that's good. Let's get an ice cream cone. You're eating the ice cream cone. Want to go to the movies? You go to the movies. Let's get a piece of pizza. Let's get that late television show. Let's make love. I'm exhausted, let's go to sleep. And you start all over again the next day. And it's always that, have you ever noticed it? I mean, am I alone in this? It's that constant, like, the mind is always living just, if only, as soon as, if, then. And how often do you just sit here and say, this is enough? I mean, you even may come here tonight to try to collect wisdom. Everything you need to know, you already know. I don't know anything you don't know. I just say it well. You'll notice I'll say something, you go like that. Well, how did you know? Either you knew or you didn't know. If you know, you go like that. You knew what you need to come here for. So the model in your head that you're collecting something is keeping you from being here. Because you're someone going somewhere. And I hate to tell you, but there's nowhere to go. This is it. This is it. If this isn't it, there isn't any. Everything you did in your entire life was preparation for this moment. This is it. See? You say, I can't afford to stop. I mean, I have commitments, I have responsibilities, I have contracts, I have a job, that doesn't matter, you can do all that. You can either do it from thinking you're going somewhere, or having arrived, and then you do what you do. I have nowhere to go. And then this just happens. It's interesting, like your heart is beating. You're not making your heart beat. Beat, beat, damn it, beat. I've got to keep my eye on it. Beat, watch it, beat, beat. I'd like to talk to you, but I've got to keep it beating. Beat, beat, beat. Make sure my intestines are working. Keep moving the stuff down, through. Beat, move, beat. Better breathe. Breathing in, breathing out. Breathing in. You see, that's all going on. And you're listening to me. You don't spend hardly any time doing that. Many of you drive cars. And you can be sitting, driving a huge metal monster, at precipitous speeds while listening to the radio, thinking about where you're going, perhaps making love, looking out the rear window for a policeman, smoking, whatever you smoke. It all can be happening, and you're just driving along, and you're not busy driving at all. This tremendously complex thing you're doing with centrifugal and centripetal forces and rates of acceleration. I mean, it's a physics problem that would cover pages. You're not even thinking about it. It's all in what's called base brain. It's interesting when all life gets that way. What do? What will we do with the rest of the time? It's even further out than that because there's no time. Everything of you that's in time is all passing show. It's all corrupting and falling apart anyway. Christ said, lay not up your treasures where moth and rust doth corrupt. That includes your body and your personality and your friends and your loved ones. Everything's changing, everything's dissolving, it's all going. It could make you nervous. If you identified with it, if you think you are a form of any kind, even a thought, unfortunately, it's all going to change. I mean, you are at this moment dying. You may not have realized it, but everybody in here is decaying. It's built into the system. You can eat as much wheatgrass as you want, and you will still decay and die. Just like the trees drop their leaves, it's built into the system. If you identify with your Volvo, sooner or later, even a Volvo, oh no, not a Volvo, even a Volvo, it will go. It can't go. It's my Volvo. It's my body. This is your life. It's my life. It's going. You remember the poem Ozymandias? Somebody's walking out in the desert and they see a stone sticking out of the sand. And there's an inscription on the stone and they decipher it and it says, I am Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing more remains. That's it. That's it. If you are busy thinking you are somebody going somewhere, doing something that's going to amount to something, suffering. It's as simple as that. Buddha pointed out in his second noble truth, the cause of suffering is the clinging of mind. If your mind clings to anything, that clinginess, you are clinging to something and you're trying to hold it and it's changing right out from under you. You get what you want, you try to hold on to it. You have what you don't want, you try to get rid of it. The clinging, the attachment, the aversions, all of them create the suffering. I used to try to figure out who I was. And then I realized that that question led me back into the void. That every answer I gave wasn't really the truth. It's as if who we know ourselves to be is like the tip of an iceberg. And there's this vast quality of our being beneath it. As you touch that part of you that is not knowable by your intellect, It is not knowable as an object, because it's subject. It's I am. It's is. It's ah. Ram Tirtha, a beautiful poet, speaks of it. He says, I am without form, without limit. I am beyond space, beyond time. I am in everything. Everything is in me. I am the bliss of the universe. Everywhere I am. Just for a moment, imagine that that's true. And you can use the thing I work with, this little channel selector. See, and you look at me and you see 55-year-old, well-preserved, rather nice-looking gentleman. Flip, you see a pleasant seeker after truth in a teaching role. On the second plane, you see everybody's socio-psycho dynamics. There's a mother, there's a professor, there's a student, there's a manic depressive, there's a depressed person, there's a hopeful person. That's the plane when you're in therapy, that's the real one. Those two planes of reality are where 99% of the world's population live almost all the time. When my father used to say to me during the 60s, Richard, come down to reality, he meant that. Get a job, economics, physical, psychological realm. Flip it again. I look out in the audience, or you look up here, you see an Aries. I see a Sagittarius, a Leo. Another matrix of individual differences. These are all relatively real. I can tell you are different from you on the physical plane. You're a man, you're a woman. I can tell you are different from you on the psychosocial plane, your roles, your social identity. I can tell the difference between you and your astral planes when your sun is rising, your moon, etc. But now flip it once more, and when I look at you, or I look at you, or I look at you, or you look at me, if you look into my eyes, what you see is another being just like you, except that I'm packaged differently. That's why the Christians talk about the eyes being the windows of the soul. It's as if you meet an awareness, an entity, that just happens to be traveling in this particular spacesuit on this planet at this moment. See, when you came here, you got all suited up for the trip. It includes your body and your personality. That's your suit. It isn't who you are. It's your suit you're wearing. It's part of who you are, but it's not all of it. Are you in there? I'm in here. How did you get into that one? You have this extraordinary feeling like you're meeting another being just like you, but who's in an entirely different universe because of their packaging. Because how people see them, how they see others through their eyes, through their habits of thought, all of that stuff, which is the packaging, And they think they're the package. And everybody goes around with these huge mind nets. They walk down the street, this is who I am, this is who I am, this is who I am. And we enter into conspiracies. I'll make believe you are who you think you are, if you'll make believe I am who I think I am. And we don't want to upset the apple cart. Nobody asks for truth. We just ask for security. And we are constantly picking up cues as to who everybody thinks they are, and we constantly occurring each other. Oh, if you turn the dial once more, and we look at each other, I'm looking at myself, looking at myself, looking at myself. Because there's only one of us in drag. We just appear to be many. This is the play of the one. This is God as creativity. You are the creation. Who you think you are is the creation. Who you really are is the creator. And you have a choice whether to identify with being the creator or the creation. As long as you identify with the creation, you're being had. You're just an unfolding set of laws. No big deal. I have free will. Forget it. You don't have any free will. Who you think you are doesn't have any free will. Who you really are has all the free will in the universe. You are free. You're the creator. To accept the fact you created yourself, not you, your personality didn't create it. That's the creation. Is this too heavy, or can you hear what I'm talking about? Anybody here? It's okay? I can't. I have this spooky friend. His name is Emmanuel. He doesn't have a body. He speaks through a woman named Pat Rodriguez. I have learned over the years that everybody that doesn't have a body isn't wise. Just because we don't have bodies, we can't not have bodies. We get a feeling that anybody that doesn't have a body must know. But there are a lot of well-meaning slobs on this level who die and they want to do good, see? But they don't know any more than they knew before because it's just continuity of awareness. So they say, buy United States Steel, and they lost in the stock market on earth and they'll lose in heaven. You know, everybody says, the voice came to me, I had a vision, buy United States Steel, and they lose their shirts. If you were frightened of the apocalypse on earth, you'll probably be on a plane where you're frightened of it in heaven. Watch out, the world's coming to an end. I heard the world's coming to an end. Well, Emmanuel is very light and playful. I mean, you got to trust non-embodied beings, disembodied beings with your heart. You can't know them with your mind because your mind says, what the hell, there's no such thing as a disembodied being. Pat Rodriguez is just schizophrenic. She doesn't even know she's talking to herself. Poor thing. But see, I don't care whether it's her schizophrenia or it's somebody else called Emmanuel, because I just want the truth. I want the stuff. And I'll decide with my heart whether it's valid. I don't care where it comes from. But Emmanuel is so light. I mean, when I said to him, Emmanuel, I'm in the dying business. I work with people that are dying. What should I tell people? He said, Ram Dass, tell them that it's absolutely safe. Can you hear that? He said, death is like taking off a tight shoe. Who wouldn't trust somebody like that? And he says to me, you have your choice, Ram Dass, of being the victim or being the creator. As long as you identify with who you think you are, with the form, with the dance, with the unfolding of forms, you are part of the lawful nature of karma, the Tao, yin and yang, positive and negative, dark and light, good and evil. You're part of all the world of dualism. He said that was what you took birth for, to get lost in that and then to awaken. That's part of the creative act of the one. And by the way, the one is only a concept of one when you're looking at it from two. From within one, it's zero. There's no one. Where did one come from? Because the one has no manifestation. It's just immanent, or it's unmanifest, or it's... And then it comes into form to play. This is all play. Remember Hermann Hesse's Journey to the East, I think. And Leo, the servant, who turns out to be the wise man, meets H.H. many years later, Henry Haller. And Henry Haller's a bitter old man because he left the Journey to the East. And he says to Leo, you don't mean to say life's just a game? That all this is just play? Leo says, that's exactly what I mean. An exquisitely beautiful game. Not game, play, irrelevant, haha. But a game, a beautiful set of the unfolding of law. When you play Monopoly, you don't think you're the iron or the thimble. See, but when you play life, you think you're the bodies. It's very bizarre. I'm moving down the street. I'm moving from Boardwalk to Baltic Avenue. Huh. I said to Emmanuel, what's my work on earth, Emmanuel? What am I doing here? Because see, I gotta tell you that ever since the 60s, when Tim Leary turned me on, that Irish rascal, and he showed me that I wasn't who I thought I was, rather dramatically. Because I had spent so many years being neurotically miserable, being who I thought I was, as a Jewish upwardly mobile achiever, with all my sexual mashugana business. And analysis hadn't helped. And I had depressions. So that this plane, these physical, psychological planes, weren't exactly they weren't a bundle of fun for me. And so once I tasted that I wasn't that stuff, and I experienced this feeling of I'm home, it's okay, I'm free. I am. I got catapulted out of who I thought I was. And I began to understand what the meaning of getting high was. I had gotten high. And boy, did I want to stay high. But as some of you may have noticed, where there is high, there is low. And you go up and you come down. A little like a yo-yo. And it took me a long time, years, to realize that the game wasn't to get high, the game was to become free. I kept wondering what brought me down all the time. I finally knew how to get high, that wasn't the question. I think everybody figured out how to get high. A lot of people didn't do it with chemicals, they could do it with sex, with surfing, with skiing, with running, once you knew that it was possible and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones told you that was high. I mean, you didn't listen to the mystics, but these were the current mystics, Bob Dylan. Then suddenly you saw it everywhere. It had been happening all the time, but you treated it like you were insane before. My God, I was out of my mind. Hopefully. There's an interesting line in the mystic literature that says, there is nowhere to stand. There's nowhere to stand. See, at first you stand in what you learned yourself to be, and you look up at heaven, and these cathedrals are all designed so you can look up to God, look up to the Spirit. And then you transform yourself in one way or another so that you go from here to there, and then you're there looking down on here. Yes. So that's how it all is. I mean, there are planes here where you look out and all you see is the perfection of the unfolding of the law. That's all you see. And it's awe-full. It's full of awe. You are filled with awe by the incredible, I mean, you know it in little ways. You mean, you know it in psychology, well, that doesn't have very much law, but that we know yet. It all has law, but we don't know it. But you know it in physics, genetics, astronomy, the way the planets move. You allow that the planets are all moving lawfully, but you don't think of yourself as part of that lawful structure. But then you see that everything that is in form is in law, and you look at it, you see it all. And at that moment, you look out and you say, it's all unfolding perfectly. It's a strange place to be in. It's not human. It's a place you're looking at it from here, and you see it's all perfect. And if somebody falls down in front of you, you say, perfect. Karma. This is karma. It's a cold place. It's like a cold blue place. You're looking down. Then you come back down and you come into your human heart. And you look at the suffering around you. And it hurts so bad. I mean, there's suffering. And when you go to reach for that one, there's suffering. But what about that suffering? And what about that one? I mean, there are the obvious sufferings of starvation, of violence, of torture. There are the subtle sufferings of neurosis, the sufferings of yearnings that are unfulfilled. Everywhere you look at forms, you will see the quality that a form imprisons, and there is suffering. As a human, and your heart hurts so bad. You come up here and you say, it's all perfect. You come down here and you say, oh my God, it stinks. It's getting worse. We're doing ourselves in ecologically. We're living with a bomb over our heads. We're polluting the air, the water. There's more violence. There's more terrorism. There's more economic uncertainty. There's more discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots. It's getting worse. Go up, perfect. All unfolding just as it should be, including the suffering. If you stand in either one of those, you're standing somewhere. And there is nowhere to stand. That is relatively real, and so is that one. You are both the one, you are an awareness, you are an astral entity, you're a psychological entity, you're a physical entity. You're a set of biochemical, electrical patterns. You are an illusion. That's all equally real. How do you live with all that? Do you do it sequentially? Now I'm my body. Now I'm spirit. I got high, I came down. That's what you do first. Up, down. I said to Emmanuel, what's my work on earth? Emmanuel said, you're in a school. Why don't you try taking the curriculum? Why don't you try being human? I'd never thought of that. I was so busy trying to get high, trying to become spiritual, and push my humanity away. And it began to dawn on me that freedom was going to come through form, not in spite of it. That incarnation isn't an error. That we are not in the wrong place at this moment. That where you are is exactly where you are supposed to be at this moment. You may think it's an error because it's too hard for you as a human being to handle what's happening. It's interesting because if you push away your humanity to get up there, you're standing on tiptoe. You are not balanced because you're pushing something away. It's a clinging of mind. If you get so immersed in your humanity that you forget your divinity, you're clinging of mind. And you end up being trapped in righteousness. That's a heavy one. That's called the golden chain. It's golden, but it's still a chain. Righteousness. Christ said, I am in the world, but not of the world. The way to freedom lies through form, not in spite of form. If you try being a renunciate, I mean, most of the people that are celibate are just horny celibates because they're pushing away something. You don't have to push yourself away to be free because you are. All of it is okay. You are it. The mind, see, you're all of it, and you decide, as part of your creative act, I'll go into separateness so that this is all creativity, so I can know myself through many forms. So you go in, and in order to go into form, there's got to be positive, negative, dark, light, all that stuff. Otherwise, there's no form. And there's resistance and darkness and all that stuff. That's the stuff you play with. And you go in and it's real. And then at some point in the journey, somewhere down the reincarnational road of illusion and dreams, you start to say, wow, it isn't like I thought it was. And you start to come up for air. And it's so tasty that you want to push away. And you come up, and then you feel you're being caught in something, and you look at what you're caught in, and you're caught in the rejection of one of the parts of your own creation. And finally, you have to not only accept, but appreciate fully your incarnation. Appreciate it all. Depression, what do you know? No. There's depression. That's different than I'm depressed. Now, the psychologist says, watch out, don't dissociate. Don't push it away. Oh, I'm beyond all this. That's phony. You're not beyond it, you're in it, and yet you're not in it. This is where the mind boggles because of the paradoxes of it all. Are you form or are you formless? Both. Are you free or are you lawful determinism? Both. Is it perfect or does it stink? Both. Is there something to do or nothing to do? Both. Can you stretch enough to be in form and not in form at the same time? All the methods, the spiritual methods, whether it's bhakti or gyan or dhyan or meditation or Tantra or Karma Yoga or all the different forms of yoga, all the different forms of meditation, all the different techniques of Tai Chi, and all of these things are designed to extricate you from the attachments of mind, to let you come up for air to the other part of your being. Every method for it to work is a trap. You get trapped in the method. So you're meditating to quiet your mind and you become a meditator. Are you free? No, I'm not free, but I'm a meditator. And there are people who have been meditators for 40 years. And they got trapped by their method. Because if a method is worth its salt, it's self-destruct. This will self-destruct in 5 seconds. You use it and you come out the other end. And you're beyond method. Most of my audiences, for years I was saying, get high, let go, relax, come on up and dance, come on out and play. Hey, come on out and play. And they'd all have their noses pressed against the window. I can't, my mother said I can't, it's too late. And I'm out there bouncing my ball, come on out and play. And then I saw all these people out in La La Land. And I said, come on, get your act together, learn your zip code, get a job. Because you see, they were standing here, then they were standing there, and then they had to come back. Because you got to come back to complete the circle. From here, you see that it's all unfolding perfectly, and there's nothing to do. And as you look at that perfection includes your humanity and your yearnings and your feelings of heart, of compassion. That's all part of what you see as the perfection. And then you come back and you are comfortable being human because it's all right to be human. It's a very far out blend. You meet people constantly, and they are busy thinking they are who they are, and you have a moral responsibility not to awaken them. You try to, and they'll probably kill you anyway. It's like Plato's cave, where everybody was looking at the shadows on the walls of the cave, and that was, they'd been chained for so long in the cave that they assumed that was reality. And then one man escaped from the cave, and he went out into the sunshine, and he came back and he said, hey, everybody, this is all an illusion. This isn't the way it is. And they stoned him to death. You walk into a bank, you walk up to the teller, you look and you see the Divine Mother. If you start to get weird, she'll push the button. She's a teller, don't screw around. I am a teller. I know you, you're the Divine Mother in drag. You're just appearing to be a teller. I see through the veil. Young man, I've never been so insulted in my life. You learn to keep your own confidences. Because you look out and you just see all these souls going through all these journeys they're taking so seriously. They all think it's so real. I mean, will Ram Dass give a good lecture, or won't he? Will I achieve fame? Will I help people? How poignant he is. How poignant he is. I mean, I'm just a rent-a-Ram Dass, the way I see it. You wind me up and out comes Dharma. I'm just sitting here. I'm sitting inside just enjoying the evening. All this is happening. This is what's known as a happening. In fact, it's all a happening. You're either around for the enjoyment of that happening or you're busy happening. I can't enjoy it, I'm busy happening. People are afraid if they don't take themselves seriously, it'll all fall apart. The funny thing is that when you don't, it's like the statement, truth waits for eyes unclouded by longing. Or the other one, quietness is master of the deed. Or here's the best one, I think. Out of emptiness arises compassion. See, you think compassion comes out of that emotional and caring and pity and empathy and all that stuff. You're afraid to let it go for fear you won't be human. And then you start to empty your mind and empty your mind. A couple of years ago, a year and a half ago, I went to Rangoon, Burma for some meditation in a monastery. Because I realized that what I was trapped in was my own mind. And how do you get out of your own mind? You can't stop it. And each thought comes along and says, think me, I'm real. And if you try to extricate yourself from that one's got you. It's all like sticky stuff. And that's why in the West we started to think cogito ergo sum. You started to think you are your thoughts. But once you understand that isn't the way it is, then you start to look for disciplines to get you out of it. So I found a really simple, no-nonsense discipline. It was in Buddhism, and I'm a Jewish, Christian, Hindu, but I'll take anything that'll work. So I went to Burma. There were 800 Burmese and 5 of us Westerners. Some of you may know some of my fellow students, Joseph Goldstein and Sharon Salzberg. We'd start every morning at 3 a.m. and meditate until 11 p.m. You had a meal at 5 a.m., a meal at 11:30 a.m. All the rest of the time you took only water. The meditation consisted of following the rising and falling of the muscle in your abdomen that moves with each breath. Rising, falling, rising, falling, rising, falling, rising, falling. 3 in the morning until 11 at night, 7 days a week, 4 hours of sleep, 2 meals. You look at nobody, you talk to nobody. Once a day, except once a day, you see your teacher for 5 minutes. You walk in and you say, I wish to report on my meditation. And he looks up and he says, yes. And you say, I was following the rising and falling of my breath. I brought my awareness to the rising. I noted it as arising. I brought my awareness to the falling. I noted it as falling. The arising had the quality of buoyancy, of coolness. The falling had density, contraction. After about 2 minutes, I became aware of the sound of a bird. I noted it as listening. Did you notice the bird on a rising or a falling breath? I didn't notice. Please try to do better. Did you awaken this morning on a rising or a falling breath? I didn't notice. Be more alert. You're dismissed. Day after day. And your mind, every time you start to follow your breath, like the center of a flower, your mind goes, whoop. I mean, I was able to have 7 hours sexual fantasies. Uninterrupted. There was nobody to talk to. And every now and then I'd think I'm supposed to be following my breath. Oh, screw that. I'd look holy, see, I'd sit there like this. And if anybody looked into my cell, they'd say, boy, isn't he? He's really doing it. But after a week or two, you run out of that too. I mean, you begin to see the slimy nature of your own mind. It's so incredible how devious you are. So you start to follow your breath, and then you say, well, I'm doing pretty good. I'm following my breath. See, there's a thought. It just took you. Yeah, all right, I'm doing pretty good. By a few more weeks, and I'll be enlightened. Bring your awareness back to the rising and falling. And there's no way to hide, because one of the things you do when you report in is you say, in the last 24 hours, I have done sitting meditation for 11 hours and walking meditation for so many hours. And you can't lie because you took a vow of truth. So that you can't go into the bathroom and have, some free time. Because you got to make it up for it during sleeping hours. Because if you do less than the full thing, he just raises an eyebrow. And this is what you hired him for. I mean, he's not doing it to you. You're a volunteer. You went there. You may hate him, but that's just another thought. And finally, at first, the rising and falling is like some kind of prison. And your mind keeps wanting to go there, there, there. And then something flips, and you realize the breath is who I am. All the rest of this stuff is just thoughts that are grabbing me. And you start to quiet into the breath until pretty soon all the thoughts are like little teeny bugs around the light. They're all out here at the periphery. You can see each one saying, think me, I'm real, think me. Your back hurts, you're hungry, you should be going home. That's, stuff like that, it's all around. And it doesn't matter because you're just rising, falling, rise. And then you're still, I am following rising, I am following falling. It's just another thought. Keep going in. The only thought you're left with is rising and falling. The only thing is the movement. Until that's all there is, and you aren't. Because the whole set of balls you've been juggling of who I am has just lost its power to control you, and all there is the breath. And that is the beginning of the journey from that tradition's point of view. Because then your mind has become so concentrated, it becomes like a laser beam, and it starts to penetrate into the universe. And you start to see, because your awareness gets out of time, and you start to see things in a very different way. For example, you'll see something coming at you, which is just light and dark and whatever that you're seeing. And then you've experienced your mind going out and conceptualizing it and saying hand. See, at this moment, if I hold this up, you see hand. You almost can't be innocent enough to see what you saw as a baby before you learn the term hand. And you return to that place where you can see your mind grab the universe and keep making something out of it. And you come back to the pot where it's all possible again, because your mind hasn't narrowed all the possibilities. And the penetration goes deeper and deeper until you see the changing nature of everything. And you see that everything isn't solid, it's just a lot of changing stuff. And you directly experience it. Buddha said, don't just study it and think about it. Do it, experience it. Interesting thing happened. I was sitting in there, I had been there 2 months, and I was getting really subtle. As you can imagine. I mean, I no longer cared about anything. And a telegram arrived. All the first month, I was dreaming that a telegram would arrive and I could escape. By the second month, I didn't even want the telegram to come, and then it came. And it reported that my stepmother had cancer, and she was going to undergo surgery. My father is very old. My stepmother was considerably younger. She was taking care of my father. I got the telegram, and immediately I thought, I've got to go home. I took the telegram to my teacher. I showed it to him. He said, I would recommend you not go. He said, you're at a very subtle stage of your development now. If you really want to relieve the suffering of others, you have to relieve your own suffering first. Somebody that's caught in quicksand cannot free another. She'll be taken care of. If you go now to try to take care of her suffering out of your feelings you're having now, you will not be able to free her or anybody else, really. You're getting really close. Why don't you stay on and continue to work? You can hear what he's saying. I can hear it. I heard it perfectly, and I said to him, I've got to go home. And we both saw the poignancy of my predicament. That in addition to being a seeker after truth, I am also a Jewish middle-class boy with a family that needs him. It's my karma. And I couldn't deny it. And I went from sitting in the monastery in the cell for 17 hours a day, alone, for months. Within 3 days of flying, I was in the intensive care ward with doctors and nurses and machines and ugh. And my mind was so quiet that a doctor would come in the room who thought he was a doctor. And I just see another awareness rising, rising, falling. And very slowly, that intensive care ward, all the nurses and doctors started to get so soft. And they just started to hang around. They were so happy doing it. And I thought, whatever I'm bringing back, it's certainly catchy. See, I had had an experience. This is a funny one. I had an experience many years before. It was my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. And my mother was already sick with cancer. And this was going to be perhaps their last anniversary. It was on January 1st, their wedding. They got married New Year's Day. The night before, Tim and I and Ralph Metzer and a group of us had had a New Year's Eve gathering around the fire with very large doses of LSD. And I had timed it a little wrong because the family gathering was a brunch the next day. And there was no night, of course. We were all just making love by the fire. And in the morning, when I looked in the mirror, I wasn't there. I went to shave, and there was no face. And I thought, I think I'm in trouble. So I didn't want to scare myself, so I closed my eyes and I shaved like this, because I knew I'd scare myself. And then I got in the car to drive to my brother's, and the steering wheel kept turning into a snake, and all the people spoke foreign language, as you can tell by looking at their mouths, and I didn't know where I was. I didn't even know who my brother was, but I figured, don't scare yourself, you know where you're going, just do it. So I got to my brother's house, and I went in the house, and there were my grandmother and my parents and my nieces and nephews. They all looked very simian. They all looked like monkeys. And my grandmother was up in a tree scratching herself, and all the different members of the family were just sort of sitting around looking all alike. They all looked exactly the same. And we sat down at brunch. And I was wearing sunglasses, see, and they all figured it was New Year's Eve the night before. You're hungover. Yes, I'm hungover. Don't talk too loud, and I did the whole number. They didn't know I was drugged. And I don't know about other Jewish families, but in our family, love is expressed in a very bizarre way. There's this kind of cutting sarcasm. So I was sitting opposite my brother, and he looked over at me. I was a psychologist at Harvard. And he said, "Well, how's the nut business?" And I saw an arrow come out of his mouth and come across the table. And I psychically reached up, and I took the arrow, and I put it down next to my spoon. And I said to him, "Gee, Bill, your kids are looking beautiful these days. They're really growing wonderfully." I sent this heart out of my mouth, and it went across, and I saw a look of confusion on his face. And then he said, "Well, you certainly, all your wisdom, you don't seem to be growing any more hair." Another arrow came out of his mouth. I took the arrow, I put it down next to the other one. And I said, "Bill, you and Helen are looking younger all the time. It's just incredible. You really look successful and wonderful. It's a good-looking suit." Heart going across. Confusion. That afternoon, I can't tell you what happened because, of course, I was drunk, but in the afternoon, all the family were sitting around in chairs, huddling, holding each other. The kids were on the laps. Everybody was quiet and content. We got out on the street. Nobody could get in their cars to go away. I thought, well, it all looks beautiful to me, but how would I know? Because you know how I am, what state I'm in. So I'll wait and listen. And the next day, there were all these people calling and saying, "Isn't our family beautiful? Wasn't that an extraordinary day? Wasn't that unusual?" And I realized that the minute I was open and felt safe enough to be loving in the presence of the world just the way it was all free to change. That I was no longer in a reactive reaction, in reacting to it. I was responding to it instead of reacting to it. Can you hear that one? Yes? No? Yeah. And the same in the intensive care ward. So I started to take care of my stepmother, take care of my father. Now, I could have had the model of, if it weren't for them, I'd be getting enlightened. A lot of people come up to me and say, if I didn't have children, I could meditate. They're saying exactly that. But I had learned my lesson, and I realized that it was through my karma that I would become free, not in spite of it. And so I started to take care of my stepmother and be with my father and help my father. And I watched the way in which my mind, just as I'm following the breath, getting my father up. He gets on the walker, walking into the bathroom. Lift, push, place. Lift, push, place. Toileting, wiping. I watched my mind. Each day that I'd wake him up and take him to the bathroom, I'd be on a different trip. I'd be on the young man serving his father trip. I'd be on the taking care of this old man trip. I'd be on the I'm going to help my father spiritually awaken trip. I'd be on the humor trip, full of jokes. Each day I watched my mind grab and become somebody doing something. But the quietness inside kept making me let go and let go and let go until there was just good morning, blood pressure, sitting up, walking, toileting, bathing, dressing. We were just right here. He was quiet. He was here all the time. He was letting me go through all my nonsense. He was just right here. And slowly I got here, just in the moment, in the movement, brushing his bridge. Not thinking I'm brushing his bridge. Not thinking, aren't I good to be brushing his bridge? And I began to see that it was a perfect upaya. It was a perfect spiritual practice. It was as good as breathing in and breathing out. Brushing bridge, back and forth, back. Now giving bridge back. And each thing became perfect in what it was. And I started to get so quiet and go into bliss and rapture. No, bliss, rapture. Brushing bridge, brushing bridge. It gets so clean and simple and present. And I was in ecstasy, and my brother Billy said to me, "Gee, Rich, it's really good of you to be taking care of Dad." Meaning he didn't want to do it. See, I milked it for what I could. I said, "Well, Bill, somebody's got to do it." You think I was going to tell him that I was in ecstasy? I mean, what kind of a fantasy is that? He's 50 years old, he's living at home taking care of his father. Poor guy. Poor guy. That was what was on the plate in front of me. People say, I want to help the suffering, so I'm going to go to India. And they leave a scene that is such a mess to go relieve suffering. Suffering's right in front of you. And as compassion arises out of emptiness, the quieter you get, the quieter I got in Nepal, the more it felt, I looked out and I felt the nature of the way it was all related, and I was much more in the space where your suffering is my suffering, because if my hand is on the fire, the other hand will pull it out. This hand doesn't say thank you, because it's all one being. It's interesting, we go up and we say we're all one, we're all sisters and brothers, and then we come down and say, but it's my television set. And you learn how to keep those together. As they say in Islam, trust in God, but tie your camel. Gandhi said, beautiful quote, I'll read it to you. He said, God demands nothing less than complete self-surrender as the price for the only freedom, real freedom, that is worth having. And when a person thus loses, I'll use herself, she immediately finds herself in the service of all that lives. It becomes her delight and recreation. She is a new person, never weary of spending herself in the service of God's creation. It's interesting that as you extricate yourself from identification with your own I want, I need my space, am I getting enough? What's in it for me? I'm growing old, all that stuff. And you're quiet. The whole universe is what you are part of. And then the suffering, you just move towards relieving it. You become an instrument of it. You're not even busy doing it anymore, because that's just another thought. It's as if you have turned into a compassionate heart, the compassionate heart of the Christ. Not the romantic heart, not the pitying heart, not the empathizing heart. The heart. Ask not for whom the bell tolls. You and I have a spontaneous generosity of heart. We have the entire source within us, and that source is safe, and it loves, and it reaches out, and you say, my heart goes out to you. The intellect, in the service of our separateness, says, watch out, don't give away the store to the heart. And your intellect is constantly holding you back. Your heart is constantly doing this. When you realize who you are, that you are free, that you're safe, what can anybody do to you? That's what Christ said. What can you do to me? Shame me, go ahead. Think you got me? Oh, you think it's my body? Go ahead, nail me up. You think you got me? That isn't who I am either. I mean, he made a statement that was very bizarre. It was very far out. He said, look, I am not my body and I'm not my personality and you can't get me. And you can see the meaning of that. The minute you bought what he did and said, that's true, that that was a true act, the minute that opens your faith in the possibility that you aren't who you think you are immediately free from suffering. Because from then on, all the suffering becomes a clue to you of where you're holding, and it's a clue to help you with your work. See, when you want to get high, you want to stay away from suffering. You want to go into a cave and get high by yourself. People bring me down. I'm not going to New York. It brings me down. I hate cities. They bring me down. I can be high in the country. I can be high with you, but he brings me down. Casper Weinberger really brings me down. But as long as your high pushes away anything, you are not free, and you're frightened. Because the city will bring you down. Casper will get you. And then you get to the point where you realize that anything that brings you down is your problem. It's a clue to your work on yourself. When somebody is a complete stinker, if you get caught in their stinkerness, it's your problem. And instead of constantly saying, you know, I love you, but I'd love you better if you put your smelly socks in the hamper. That's like looking at oak trees and pine trees and saying, you're great, but it would be better, pine, if you were an oak. Funny, with humans, we're constantly judging each other. Finally, you understand that the stuff that turns you off in the world is your models in your head. And you can finally, somebody rips you off. Okay. You'll be better at tying your camel the next time. But if you get angry and judgmental of that person, their mind caught you. And you want to get to the point where they're all doing what they're doing. You allow people to incarnate the way they incarnate. You don't sit around judging them. You just appreciate them. And if something gets you, some suffering, like you get cancer or AIDS and you're suffering. I work with AIDS patients. Somebody's young, they're full of life, and suddenly they've got AIDS, and they're facing death and sickness and sores and pain and It's very seductive. It's hard not to get caught in the drama. How do we help another human being? By not reinforcing the drama. In order not to reinforce the drama, you can't be identified with your own drama. If I sit down with somebody with AIDS and I think I'm helping them, forget it. They're now somebody that needs to be helped. When actually, you here, I'm here. You have an interesting incarnation this time. It includes AIDS. And it's extraordinary that when your mind is quiet enough and you're present enough, somebody else can get loose from their suffering if they're ready. You have no moral right to take away their suffering. If the Jewish mother wants to sit in the dark, that's her choice. But you can become an environment so spacious that anybody can get free around you that's ready. That's why you work on yourself. That's what help you offer. You work on yourself through everything in your life. And when something catches you, it's a good chance to work on yourself. When somebody gets you angry, it's just the guru in drag who's come to show you your stash of clinging of mind. Okay, that's a clue I'm supposed to stop. When babies cry, I was told,